When 72-year-old Duke Alistair Pemberton inherited Blackthorn Castle, he thought he understood disappointment. After all, his elder brother received the grand estate while he got the cursed wing, a crumbling section sealed for 3 centuries, following unexplained deaths that had haunted family whispers for generations. The locals warned him never to break the seal. His own solicitor advised against it, but the Duke had spent a lifetime challenging superstition, and at his age, fear seemed like a luxury he could no longer afford. On a fog-laden November night, he took a crowbar to the rusted lock and pushed open the heavy oak door. What he found inside that forgotten chamber would prove that some family secrets demand to stay buried, and some curses are simply the truth waiting to be discovered. But what was written in that ancient journal that made him question everything he knew about his bloodline? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The inheritance deed lay on the mahogany desk before Duke Alistair Pemberton, its yellowed parchment crackling softly as he turned it in his weathered hands. The document bore the family seal, impressed deep into crimson wax that had darkened with age. He read the clause again, though he had memorized every word during the reading 6 months prior. To my second son, Alistair James Pemberton, I bequeath the western wing of Blackthorn Castle, known colloquially as the Cursed Wing, with all fixtures, furnishings and sealed chambers therein. Sealed chambers. His father had known. Of course he had known. Alistair set the deed down and walked to the window of his temporary study, a room that had once served as a butler's office in the habitable portion of the wing. Beyond the rain-streaked glass, the November landscape stretched in shades of grey and brown. The gardens, once immaculate, had surrendered to wildness decades ago. Blackthorn Castle rose against the darkening sky like a monument to faded glory, its Gothic spires piercing low clouds that seemed to catch on the stonework. He was 72 years old, and this was his inheritance. Not the grand estate his brother Edmund had received, with its maintained grounds and profitable tenant farms. Not the London townhouse or the investment portfolio, just this crumbling wing of a castle too large for its own good, haunted by stories that had kept locals crossing themselves for 300 years. More tea, Your Grace. Mrs. Hodges stood in the doorway, silver service in hand. She had been with the family for 40 years, first as a housemaid, now as his sole domestic staff. Her face, kind but careworn, showed the careful neutrality of someone who had learned when not to comment. Thank you, Mrs. Hodges. And please, Alistair is fine. I think we're past formality. She poured with practiced precision, the china clinking softly. Your brother telephoned while you were walking the grounds. I told him you'd ring back. Edmund. Alistair sighed, accepting the cup. Let me guess. He wants to know if I've come to my senses yet. He didn't say as much, but... Miss Hodges paused, choosing her words. He did ask if you'd been near the sealed door. Everyone asks about the sealed door. Alistair moved back to his desk, settling into the leather chair that had belonged to his grandfather, as if I'm going to open it on a whim and unleash some gothic horror on the countryside. Mrs. Hodges said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. The truth was more complicated than superstition, though perhaps no less unsettling. Alistair had spent 30 years in the military, rising to the rank of colonel before retirement. He had seen combat in places the Ministry of Defense still wouldn't publicly acknowledge. He had made decisions that cost lives and saved others. Fear, he had learned, was simply information that needed to be processed rationally. But since moving into the Cursed Wing 3 weeks ago, rationality had become an increasingly difficult refuge. It had started small, sounds in the night that Miss Hodges attributed to old pipes and settling foundations, cold drafts that seemed to emanate from the sealed door itself, despite the lack of any visible gaps in the stonework, dreams that left him waking with Eleanor's name on his lips, though his wife had been dead for 2 years. Eleanor, God, how he missed her. They had been married for 47 years. She had been his compass, his conscience, the voice of reason when his military pragmatism veered toward callousness. Her death, a fall down the main staircase of Edmund's estate during a family visit, had shattered something in him that he wasn't sure could be repaired. The official verdict was accidental death, loss of balance, tragic but not suspicious, but Eleanor had never been clumsy. Even at 70, she had moved with the grace of a dancer. Your Grace. Mrs. Hodges's voice pulled him from his reverie. Forgive me, but you look tired. Perhaps you should rest before Dr. Whitmore arrives. Geoffrey's coming. Alistair checked his watch. I'd forgot. He telephoned yesterday, quite insistent about checking on you. She hesitated. He's concerned, as am I, if I may say so. You may always say so, Mrs. Hodges. Alistair managed a smile, though I assure you I'm perfectly sound of mind. It's not your mind that concerns me, it's your heart. She collected the tea service. Grief has its own timeline. Moving into this wing, so soon after her grace's passing, it's a lot to bear. After she left, Alistair returned to the window. The rain had intensified, turning the grounds into an impressionist painting of greys and blacks. Somewhere in the distance, Thomas the groundskeeper was securing the garden shed against the storm. The man was nearly 80 but refused to retire, claiming the castle grounds needed someone who understood them. Alistair's thoughts drifted back to the will reading, 6 months ago in Edmund's study. The solicitor, a thin man named Pembroke, who had served the family for decades, had read the terms with professional detachment. Edmund had received what everyone expected. The shock came when Pembroke reached Alistair's portion. The cursed wing. Edmund had stood abruptly, his face flushed. Father left him that abomination? There are additional clauses, Pembroke had continued, unperturbed. The Duke specifically notes that the wing is to remain in Alistair's possession, that it cannot be sold separately from the main estate, and that, he paused, adjusting his spectacle, that the younger son has always been given this inheritance, dating back to the castle's construction. That detail had struck Alistair as odd. Even then, he had researched the family history in the months since, poring through dusty records in the castle's library. The pattern held true. For 3 centuries the eldest son inherited the grand estate, the second son received the cursed wing. When there was no second son, the wing remained sealed and unused until the next generation. What tradition or superstition had compelled generation after generation of Pembertons to maintain this division? The sealed door stood at the far end of the western corridor, past rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets, and portraits of ancestors, whose names he barely remembered. Alistair had walked past it, dozens of times, always pausing to study the heavy oak barrier. The door itself was unremarkable save for its age, and the iron bands that reinforced it. The lock, however, was another matter entirely. Massive and ornate, the lock seemed designed more for ceremony than security. Strange symbols had been carved into the metal, worn smooth by centuries but still visible. Alistair had photographed them, intending to research their meaning, but hadn't yet found the time or perhaps the courage to pursue it seriously. Dr. Geoffrey Whitmore arrived as the afternoon light was failing. He was Alistair's oldest friend, dating back to university days when both had been young men convinced they would change the world. Geoffrey had pursued medicine while Alistair chose military service, but their friendship had endured through marriages, children, and the gradual accumulation of years that made young men into old ones. "You look dreadful," Geoffrey announced cheerfully, setting his medical bag on the entry table. He was a broad man with white hair and the ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed his whiskey. "When did you last sleep properly?" "Good to see you too, Geoffrey." Alistair embraced his friend. "Come in. Mrs. Hodges has left us some supper." They ate in the small dining room, a space far more manageable than the grand hall Edmund now presided over. Geoffrey kept the conversation light, discussing mutual acquaintances and complaining about the state of the National Health Service. But Alistair could see him observing, noting details with a physician's trained eye. "So," Geoffrey said finally, pushing away his plate, "are you going to tell me what's really going on, or shall I diagnose you from symptoms alone?" "I'm fine, Geoffrey. You're not sleeping, you've lost weight. Mrs. Hodges tells me you spend hours staring at that sealed door." Geoffrey leaned forward. "Talk to me, old friend. Not as your doctor, but as someone who's known you for 50 years. Alistair considered deflecting, but Geoffrey would see through it. He always had. "Do you believe in curse?" "I believe in psychology, grief, and the power of suggestion." Geoffrey's expression softened. "You've lost Eleanor, you're isolated in this dreary wing. Your mind is looking for patterns, for meaning. It's natural. What if there's more to it than psychology? Then we'll address it rationally." Geoffrey pulled out a prescription pad. "But first, you need proper sleep. I'm giving you something mild, just to help. I don't want to be medicated, and I don't want to watch my oldest friend deteriorate." Geoffrey's tone turned firm. "Alistair, you've been through Eleanor's death, this inheritance, the isolation. You're not superhuman, despite what 30 years in uniform might have taught you." Later, after Geoffrey had left with promises to return within the week, Alistair stood in the corridor outside the sealed door. The house had settled into its evening quiet, just the tick of distant clocks, and the whisper of wind, through ancient stonework. He placed his palm against the oak, feeling the cold seep through the wood. Somewhere beyond this barrier lay answers. He was certain of it now. His father had known something. The inheritance deed wasn't random, it was intentional, purposeful. A memory surfaced, unbidden, but vivid. Alistair was 12 years old, home from boarding school for the summer. He had discovered Edmund, then 16, standing before this very door with their father. The old Duke's hand had rested on Edmund's shoulder, and he was speaking in low, serious tones. "Never open it, Edmund. Promise me. When you inherit, you must ensure it stays sealed." "But what's inside, father?" "The past. And the past should remain where it belongs." Young Alistair had made a sound, some shuffle of feet that betrayed his presence. His father had turned sharply, face stern. "Alistair, come here." He had approached reluctantly, expecting punishment for eavesdropping. Instead, his father had studied him with an expression Alistair couldn't quite read. Sadness, perhaps, or resignation. "You're the second son," his father had said simply. "One day you'll understand what that means." But he hadn't understood, not then, and not during all the years that followed. His father had never spoken of it again, and Alistair had been too absorbed in school, then university, then his military career to give it much thought. The cursed wing had been a family oddity, nothing, until now. The temperature in the corridor dropped suddenly, raising gooseflesh on Alistair's arms. He pulled his hand away from the door, noting how his breath had become visible in the air. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Old wiring, he told him. The castle's electrical system dated back to the 1920s and had never been properly updated, but the cold remained, and with it came something else, a sound, barely audible, like whispered conversation from a great distance. Alistair strained to hear, pressing his ear to the door. The whispers rose and fell, rhythmic but incomprehensible. Not English, Latin, perhaps, or something older. "Your Grace." Alistair jerked back from the door. Mrs. Hodges stood at the corridor's entrance, lamp in hand. Her face was pale, eyes wide. "I heard." She paused, swallowing. "I heard voices." "Old houses make strange sounds," Alistair said, but the words felt hollow even to him. "I've worked in this castle for 40 years. Mrs. Hodges's voice trembled slightly. "I know it sounds. This is different. This started when you moved into the wing. Are you saying I'm somehow causing—" "I'm saying that door was sealed for a reason." She set the lamp on a side table. "Your father, God rest him, he used to come here. Late at night, when he thought no one was watching, he'd stand right where you're standing now, talking to it. To whatever's beyond it. Talking to—" Alistair's military training reasserted itself, demanding facts. "What did he say?" "I couldn't make out words, but he was afraid, Your Grace. I could see it in him. Whatever he knew about what's behind that door, it frightened him." She met his eyes, "And he gave it to you anyway." The implication hung between them. His father had known, had been terrified, and still bequeathed the cursed wing to his second son, maintaining a tradition that stretched back 3 centuries. After Mrs. Hodges retreated to her quarters, Alistair remained in the corridor. The whispers had faded, leaving only the normal sounds of an old building settling for the night. He thought about his father, about all the second sons who had come before him. Had they felt this pull, this inexplicable need to understand? Eleanor would have known what to do. She had possessed an intuition that complemented his rationality, seeing patterns where he saw only data. During his military career, when he struggled with difficult decisions, she had been his sounding board, not just supporting his choices, but challenging them, forcing him to consider angles his tactical mind might miss. What would she make of all this? The inheritance, the sealed door, the whispers, and cold drafts, and dreams that felt more like memories. He wished desperately that he could ask her, but Eleanor was gone, buried in the family plot beside his parents, and he was alone with questions that seemed to multiply with each passing day. Alistair walked slowly back to his study, pausing at the windows to watch the night. The storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and star-filled. In the distance, the lights of the village flickered like earthbound constellations. People there lived ordinary lives, concerned with ordinary problems. They didn't inherit cursed wings, or stand in cold corridors listening to whispers from the past. He reached for the whiskey decanter, poured 2 fingers, then thought better of it, and filled the glass properly. The liquor burned going down, a pleasant distraction from thoughts that circled like vultures. His father's study in the main estate had contained a portrait of the old Duke in his prime, stern and upright in formal dress. Alistair remembered studying that portrait as a boy, trying to find softness in those painted eyes, some hint of the warmth a son should expect from a father. He had never found it. Their relationship had been cordial but distant. The old Duke had focused his attention on Edmund, grooming him for the responsibilities of inheritance. Alistair, the spare heir, had been left largely to his own devices. He'd found purpose in the military, structure in its hierarchies, belonging in the camaraderie of soldiers who cared nothing for titles or bloodlines. But now, standing in this crumbling wing with its secrets and whispers, Alistair wondered if his father's distance had been protection. Had the old man kept him at arm's length to shield him from something, or had he been preparing him, in some oblique way, for this very moment? The study's shelves held books that dated back generations, leather-bound volumes on agriculture, history, philosophy. Alistair had been working through them systematically, looking for anything that might mention the sealed wing, or explain the family's peculiar inheritance tradition. So far, he had found nothing explicit, though certain passages gave him pause. A diary from 1847, written by his great-great-grandfather, contained a single cryptic entry. Edmund asks about the western rooms. I told him what my father told me: some doors are meant to stay closed. The second son will know when the time comes. There it was again, the second son. As if birth order carried some mystical significance, as if being born after Edmund had marked Alistair for a specific fate. He pulled another volume from the shelf, this one a family genealogy compiled in the Victorian era. The Pemberton line stretched back to the 17th century, each generation meticulously documented with births, deaths, marriages. Alistair traced the succession with his finger, noting the pattern. First son inherits the estate, second son receives the cursed wing. When there was no second son, the wing remained sealed until the next generation produced one. In 1803, there had been only one son. The wing stayed locked for 30 years, until that son produced 2 boys of his own. The pattern resumed. What happened in families with no sons at all? Alistair flipped through pages, searching. There, the Pembertons of 7 only daughters. The estate had passed to a cousin, and that cousin's second son inherited the wing. The tradition was absolute, unbreakable, as if the castle itself demanded. A knock at the study door interrupted his research. Thomas stood in the hallway, cap in his weathered hands. The groundskeeper rarely came inside, preferring the gardens to the house's oppressive corridors. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, Thomas said, but there's something you should see. They walked through the grounds in silence, Thomas leading with a hurricane lamp. The old man moved with the careful steps of someone who had learned to navigate darkness through long practice. They stopped at the garden's edge, where ancient yew trees formed a natural barrier between cultivated land and wild forest. There, Thomas pointed. In the lamplight, Alistair saw them, dead birds, dozens of them, arranged in a perfect circle on the ground. Crows, by the look of them, their black feathers stark against the pale grass. They hadn't simply died and fallen, someone or something had placed them deliberately, each bird equidistant from its neighbor. Found them at sunset, Thomas said quietly. Wasn't here this morning, when I did my round. Alistair crouched, examining the nearest bird. No visible wounds, no signs of disease or struggle, just death, neat and inexplicable. Could be kids, from the village, he suggested, though he didn't believe it. Some kind of prank. Village kids don't come near the castle, Your Grace. Haven't for years. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. There's old stories, things that happen when the wing is disturbed. You're talking about superstition. I'm talking about what I've seen. Thomas met his gaze. Your father, he understood, kept the wing locked, kept to himself about it. But he knew, just like his father before him. Knew what exactly? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, the lamp casting shadows across his lined face. That some inheritances are curses by another. They stood together in the lamplight, 2 old men contemplating death, arranged in patterns neither could explain. The night was still, no wind to disturb the branches overhead, no sound but their own breathing, and the distant hoot of an owl. How long have you worked these grounds, Tom? Alistair asked. 53 years, come March. Started as a boy, learning from my father. He worked for your grandfather. And in all that time, have you seen things like this before? Thomas hesitated, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that some truths, once spoken, could not be taken back. 3 times, once when I was 15, just after your uncle James died. He was the second son of his generation, refused his inheritance, moved to London instead. Week after he died, we found dead birds in a circle, just like these. My uncle refused the wing. I wanted nothing to do with it. Your grandfather was furious, but James held firm, said he'd rather live in poverty than accept that bird. Thomas turned toward the castle, its silhouette black against the star-filled sky. He died young, 32. Official cause was heart failure, but what? He was healthy as an ox, never a day's illness in his life. Thomas's voice dropped. The second time was when your father first entered the wing after he inherited. Not the sealed parts, mind you, just the habitable rooms. That night, dead birds. And the third time, Alistair waited, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. 3 weeks ago, the day you moved in. The implication settled over Alistair like a cold shroud. The wing was reacting to him, to his presence, or something within the wing was announcing itself, making its awareness known through signs that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. I won't be driven out by dead birds and old stories, Alistair said, but the conviction in his voice sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Not asking you to leave, Your Grace, just asking you to be careful, to think hard before you do something that can't be undone. Thomas glanced toward the western wing, visible through the trees. That door's been sealed for 300 years. There might be good reason for it. After Thomas left to dispose of the birds, Alistair walked back to the house alone. The lamp created a small circle of light around him, beyond which the darkness seemed absolute. He thought about his Uncle James, refusing an inheritance and dying young, about his father, who accepted the burden and lived with whatever knowledge came with it, about all the second sons, stretching back through the centuries, each one faced with the same choice.
Accept or refuse. Open or keep sealed. Face the truth or live with comfortable ignorance. Eleanor had always said that Alistair's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. His need to understand, to take things apart and examine them, to solve problems through analysis and action. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, my love, she had told him once. Some doors should stay closed. Had she known something, had his father confided in her during one of their long conversations about history and family? Eleanor had been fascinated by the Pemberton lineage, spending hours in the library researching their ancestors. At the time, Alistair had thought it simply an intellectual pursuit, a historian's natural curiosity. But now he wondered if she had been looking for answers to questions she couldn't voice. The study felt oppressive when he returned. The walls too close, the ceiling too low. Alistair opened a window, letting in the night air. It carried the scent of earth and dying leaves, the smell of autumn giving way to winter. In the distance, the village church bells tolled midnight, their sound mournful across the dark countryside. He sat at his desk and pulled out a sheet of writing paper. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he began to write. Dear Edmund, I know you've been concerned about my decision to occupy the cursed wing. I want you to know that I understand your worry, and I'm grateful for it, despite our differences over the years. But I need to ask you something, brother to brother. What did Father tell you about this place? What did he make you promise? Alistair paused, considering his next words carefully. I'm beginning to understand that our inheritance is not what it seems, that the division between first son and second son carries meaning beyond mere tradition. If you know something, anything that might help me understand what I'm facing, I'm asking you to tell me. Not as a duke requesting information, but as your brother requesting truth. He signed it, sealed the envelope, and set it aside for posting in the morning. Whether Edmund would respond honestly remained to be seen. Their relationship had been strained since childhood, built on the foundation of primogeniture that made one brother essential and the other expendable. Edmund's reply arrived 3 days later, not by post but in person. Alistair heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked out to see his brother's silver Bentley pulling up to the wing's entrance. Edmund emerged, impeccably dressed as always, his grey overcoat precisely tailored. Even at 75, he maintained the bearing of someone born to authority. Mrs. Hodges showed him to the study, her expression carefully neutral. The brothers hadn't spoken face-to-face since the will reading, communicating only through brief, formal telephone calls. Alistair, Edmund remained standing, declining the offered chair. I received your letter and decided it warranted a personal visit rather than a written response. Alistair gestured again to the seat. Please, Edmund, whatever needs to be said, let's at least be civilized about it. Edmund sat stiffly, setting his walking stick against the desk. Age had bent him slightly, though he fought it with rigid posture. His face, so like their father's, showed the careful control of a man accustomed to concealing his thoughts. You asked what Father told me, Edmund began. The truth is, very little. But what he did say has haunted me for 20 years. Alistair waited, sensing that interruption would only cause his brother to retreat into formal distance. When I turned 50, Father called me to his private study, not the one in the main house, but a small room he kept in the eastern tower. I'd never been invited there before. Edmund's hands tightened on the walking stick. He poured us both a whiskey, very unlike him, and told me there were things I needed to know before he died. Things about the family, about the wing. What did he say? That every Pemberton generation carries a debt. That the wealth we enjoy, the position we hold, came at a price paid centuries ago. Edmund met Alistair's gaze. He said the sealed wing contains the evidence of that price, that it must never be opened, never be disturbed, because what's inside could destroy everything our family has built. Evidence of what price? What did our ancestors do? He wouldn't elaborate, said the less I knew, the safer I'd be. But he made me promise, Alistair, promise on Mother's grave, that I would ensure the wings stayed sealed, that I would never encourage anyone to investigate it. Alistair felt something cold settle in his chest, yet Father left it to me, knowing I wouldn't leave it alone. That's what I've been trying to understand. Edmund's voice carried genuine confusion. Father knew your character, knew you'd question, investigate, push until you found answers. So why give you the one thing he most wanted left undisturbed? They sat in silence, two brothers separated by birth order and circumstance, united only by confusion over their father's final wishes. There's something else, Edmund said finally. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small box of polished wood. Father gave me this the day he made me promise. Told me to keep it safe and give it to you if you ever moved into the wing. Alistair took the box, noting its weight, the intricate carving on its lid, symbols similar to those on the sealed door's lock. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside, nestled in black velvet, lay a key. Silver, tarnished with age, its head ornately decorated with the same strange symbols. The key to the sealed door. It had to be. He planned this, Alistair whispered, every step leaving me the wing, knowing I'd look for answers. This key, I don't understand it, Edmund admitted. Father spent his entire life protecting that secret. Why facilitate its revelation now? Alistair lifted the key, feeling its cold weight in his palm. Engraved along the shaft, barely visible, were words in Latin. He squinted, making them out. Fraditas. Liberabit vos. The truth shall set you free, Edmund translated softly. Father's favorite phrase. He had it carved above the door to his study. Did he believe it? I don't know what Father believed anymore. Edmund stood slowly, leaning on his stick. But I know what he feared. Whatever is behind that door terrified him. Alistair. I saw it in his eyes that day. A man who survived war, who built an empire from near bankruptcy, who never showed weakness to anyone. And he was afraid. Yet he gave me the key. Yes. Edmund moved toward the door, then paused. Which means either he wanted you to open it, or he wanted you to have the choice he never felt he had. I can't tell you which, because I honestly don't know. After Edmund left, Alistair sat with the key for hours, turning it over in his hands, studying every mark and symbol. The silver had darkened with age, but the craftsmanship remained exquisite. This wasn't merely functional, it was ceremonial, created for a specific purpose by someone who understood that opening the sealed door would be a momentous act. Miss Hodges brought tea at 4, eyeing the key with undisguised concern. Your brother looked troubled when he left, Your Grace. We all are, Mrs. Hodges. Alistair set the key on his desk. Tell me, in all your years here, did you ever see my father with this key? She stepped closer, peering at it without touching. No, sir, but I did see him with something similar. He kept it in a locked drawer in his bedroom. I only glimpsed it once, when I was changing linens and he'd left the drawer open. Did he know you saw it? If he did, he never mentioned it. She poured the tea with steady hands. But after that day, he was different around me. More careful, as if he worried what I might have understood. What did you understand? Mrs. Hodges was quiet for a moment, the teapot suspended above the cup. All that your father was a man living with something heavy, a burden that aged him beyond his years. He used to stand at his window, looking toward this wing, and I'd see such sadness in him, not the sadness of loss, but of knowledge, of carrying something he couldn't share. After she left, Alistair walked to the sealed door. The corridor was cold as always, that unnatural chill that had nothing to do with drafts or poor insulation. He held the key up to the lock, not inserting it, just comparing the symbols. They matched perfectly. Key and lock, made for each other across centuries. What would Eleanor do? The question rose unbidden, as it often did in moments of uncertainty. She had possessed a clarity of moral vision that he'd always admired. Right and wrong weren't always simple, she'd taught him, but the path forward usually became clear if you asked the right questions. The right question here wasn't whether he could open the door. Obviously he could. The key proved that. The question was whether he should, and more importantly, why his father had arranged for him to have this choice. That evening, Dr. Whitmore returned as promised. Geoffrey's medical bag suggested a professional visit, but his expression showed personal concern. They settled in the study with whiskey, the key sitting between them on the desk like an accusation. Edmund telephoned, Geoffrey said without preamble. Told me about your father's instructions. About this. He gestured to the key. I'm here as your friend, Alistair, not your physician. And as your friend, I have to ask. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. That's not entirely true, is it? Geoffrey's tone was gentle, but insistent. You're going to open that door. You've already decided. You're just working up the courage. Alistair couldn't deny it. The key's presence had shifted something fundamental. What had been sealed, forbidden, impossible was now merely locked, and locks existed to be opened. My father was afraid, Alistair said. Edmund confirmed it. Whatever is behind that door terrified a man who feared nothing else in this world. Doesn't that concern you? Of course it does, but it concerns me less than watching you slowly deteriorate from not knowing. Geoffrey leaned forward. I've known you since we were 20, Alistair. I've seen you face down armed insurgents, make life and death decisions under fire, bury the woman you loved. You've never backed away from hard truths. Starting now would destroy you more surely than whatever's behind that door. You think I should open it? I think you'll go mad if you don't. Geoffrey picked up the key, examining it in the lamplight. But I also think you shouldn't do it alone. If you're determined to face whatever's waiting, let me be there. Let Edmund be there. Don't carry this burden by yourself. Edmund made a promise to our father. Edmund made a promise under duress, without full information. Geoffrey set the key down, and your father clearly intended for that promise to be broken. Otherwise, why give you the key at all? Why not destroy it or keep it sealed away forever? It was a good question, perhaps the central question. Their father had maintained the seal his entire life, but provided the means to break it. A man terrified of what lay beyond the door had nonetheless ensured his son could open it. The contradiction suggested purpose, a plan that extended beyond death itself. Where? Geoffrey asked simply. Tonight. The decision crystallized as Alistair spoke it. Midnight. If we're going to do this, let's honor the theatrical nature of it. 300 years of secrecy deserves a proper unveiling. I'll telephone Edmund. He should be here. No. Alistair shook his head. Edmund made his promise. I won't ask him to break it, even if Father's design makes it inevitable. This is my inheritance. My choice. You're welcome to stay, Geoffrey, but only if you're certain. I'm certain. Geoffrey stood, moving to examine the books on Alistair's shelves, though I reserve the right to say I told you so if we find nothing but dust and old furniture. I'd welcome that outcome. But neither of them believed it would be so simple. The weight of history, the pattern of second suns, the dead birds and cold drafts and whispers, all pointed toward something significant waiting beyond that door. The only question was whether significance meant danger. They spent the evening in careful preparation. Alistair gathered lanterns, matches, his camera to document whatever they found. Geoffrey insisted on bringing his medical bag, though what ailment he expected to treat remained unspoken. Miss Hodges retreated to her cottage at the edge of the grounds, making clear she wanted no part in what was to come. "I've served this family faithfully," she said at the door, "but I won't witness what should stay hidden. God forgive me, but I won't." Thomas had similar sentiments when Alistair informed him. The old groundskeeper simply nodded, touched his cap and said, "I'll be in the garden shed if you need me. Whatever happens, I'll be there come morning to help with the aftermath." The assumption that there would be an aftermath hung unspoken between them. At 1:45, Alistair and Geoffrey stood before the sealed door. The corridor was silent except for their breathing and the tick of a distant clock. The key felt warm in Alistair's hand now, as if it had absorbed heat from his pocket or perhaps generated its own. "Last chance to reconsider," Geoffrey said, though his tone suggested he knew the futility of the offer. "I've spent 3 weeks reconsidering. It's time." Alistair raised the key to the lock. "Whatever we find, Geoffrey, I want you to know I'm grateful. For your friendship. For standing here with me when wiser men would have fled. Wisdom is overrated." Geoffrey managed a smile. "Besides, how often does one get to unveil a 300-year-old mystery? I'm rather excited, truth be told." The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been maintained despite the door's sealed status. Alistair felt tumblers shifting, ancient gears engaging. The sound echoed in the corridor, impossibly loud. He turned the key slowly, feeling resistance, then sudden release. A click, then silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The door remained closed, the corridor unchanged. Alistair wondered if the mechanism had failed, if 3 centuries had rendered the lock inoperable despite appearances. Then he felt it, a tremor through the floor, subtle but unmistakable. The temperature dropped precipitously, their breath misting in the air, and from beyond the door came a sound like an exhalation, as if the room itself had been holding its breath and finally released it. "Alistair," Geoffrey's voice was tight. The symbols, the carvings on the door's surface were glowing, faintly a blue-white luminescence that had no earthly source. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, casting strange shadows on the corridor walls. "Scientific explanation?" Alistair asked, not taking his eyes from the glowing symbols. "None that I know." "Phosphorescence, perhaps, but that would require exposure to light, and this door has been sealed in darkness for centuries." The clock struck midnight, its 12 chimes echoing through the castle. On the final note, the door moved not violently, but with slow, deliberate purpose, as if pushed by an invisible hand. It swung inward, revealing darkness beyond. Darkness, and the smell of old parchment, dust, and something else. Something that made the primitive part of Alistair's brain scream warnings his rational mind chose to ignore. "Well," Geoffrey whispered, "I suppose we'd better see what 300 years of secrecy looks like." They stepped forward together, crossing the threshold into the chamber that had been sealed since 1725. Their lanterns pushed back the darkness, revealing the first glimpses of what the Pemberton family had hidden for so long. And in that initial moment of revelation, Alistair understood with perfect clarity that his life had just divided into before and after, and there would be no going back to the man he had been when he turned that key. The chamber was larger than Alistair had expected, perhaps 30 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow above their lantern's reach. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by their entrance after 3 centuries of stillness. It caught the light like particles of suspended time, drifting lazily in the draught that flowed through the open door. The walls were stone, original medieval construction predating most of the castle's later additions, but they had been modified. Carved into the surface were those same symbols from the door and key, hundreds of them forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, rearranging themselves into configurations that made Alistair's head ache. "Good God," Geoffrey breathed, raising his lantern higher. "What is this place?" The chamber's contents slowly emerged from darkness. Furniture draped in sheets, their forms suggesting chairs and tables, bookcases lining one wall, filled with volumes whose leather bindings had cracked with age. And on the far wall, dominating the space, hung a portrait. Even in the uncertain light, the painting commanded attention. A man in 17th century dress, perhaps 60 years old, with a face that radiated both intelligence and something darker. Authority born from certainty, the kind of conviction that could justify any action. His eyes, rendered with disturbing skill, seemed to track their movement across the room. Alistair approached the portrait, drawn despite his unease. A brass plate on the frame bore an inscription, "Sir Marcus Pemberton, founder of the line 16. "Your ancestor," Geoffrey observed, joining him. "The first Duke, the man who built the family fortune." Alistair studied the painted face, searching for some familial resemblance. He found it in the set of the jaw, the shape of the brow. This man's blood ran in his veins, had run in every Pemberton for 300 years. History says he came from nothing, a minor landowner who somehow acquired this castle and enough wealth to establish a dukedom. "Somehow," Geoffrey repeated. "I'm beginning to suspect that somehow is what we're here to discover." They moved deeper into the chamber. Alistair pulled sheets from furniture, revealing chairs of excellent craftsmanship, a desk of dark wood inlaid with more of those troubling symbols. Everything was preserved as if waiting for occupants to return. No decay beyond the inevitable accumulation of dust. No signs of water damage or vermin. The room existed in a state of suspension, untouched by the centuries that had passed beyond its sealed door. On the desk lay books, some open as if someone had been reading them when interrupted. Alistair lifted one carefully, noting the brittle quality of the pages. The text was Latin, dense and difficult, but certain words stood out. Pactum, sanguis, potentia, pact, blood, power. "Geoffrey, look at this." Alistair angled the book toward the light. "These aren't ordinary ledgers or family records. These are ritual texts." Geoffrey adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the cramped handwriting. "Occult material. I've seen similar things in museums. Grimoires, books of ceremonial magic." He turned gaze delicately. "This appears to be instructions for summoning. And binding. Binding what? It doesn't specify, just refers to the benefactor and the granter of fortune." Geoffrey looked up, his face grave. "Alistair, I think your ancestor was involved in something deeply unorthodox." They found more books, each containing similar material. Diagrams showing ritual circles and specific positioning of candles and objects. Recipes for incenses and oils made from herbs. Alistair didn't recognize, and throughout, references to a pact made in 1699, renewed annually through specific ceremonies. The desk's drawers yielded more disturbing discoveries. A ceremonial dagger, its blade marked with rust-colored stains that might have been blood, dried herbs bound with thread, small bones that Geoffrey identified as human, finger bones from their size and shape. "This is mad," Geoffrey said softly. "Completely mad. Your ancestor believed he could summon supernatural forces through ritual. Believed or succeeded." Alistair indicated the portrait. "A man starts with nothing and ends with a dukedom. That requires either extraordinary luck or extraordinary assistance." The portrait of Sir Marcus seemed to watch them, his painted eyes reflecting lantern light in a way that suggested awareness. Alistair forced himself to look away, to focus on the tangible evidence rather than artistic illusions. Behind the desk, set into an alcove, stood a small altar. Black cloth, covered its surface, upon which rested items arranged with deliberate precision. More candles, burned down to stubs, a silver chalice, tarnished nearly black, and at the center, a leather-bound journal, larger than the other books, its cover embossed with the Pemberton crest. Alistair reached for it with trembling hands. The leather was cool to the touch, surprisingly supple, despite its age. He opened it carefully, mindful of the fragile pages within. The first entry was dated March 15, 1699, written in a neat, controlled hand. "I have made my decision. The family faces ruin. The debts accumulated by my father's failures will see us destroyed within the year, unless I act. Traditional means have failed. The banks refuse further loans. Our lands produce barely enough to feed the tenants. I must look to unconventional solutions, regardless of the cost to my soul." Geoffrey read over his shoulder, his breathing audible in the silent chamber. "This is Sir Marcus's personal account, a confession of sorts." Alistair turned pages, skimming entries that detailed increasingly desperate measures. Attempts to secure funding through marriage failed when potential brides discovered the extent of the Pemberton poverty. Business ventures collapsed. Even theft was considered, though Sir Marcus ultimately rejected it as too risky and beneath his station. Then, in an entry dated November 3, 1699, the tone shifted. "I have met a man who claims knowledge of the old ways. He calls himself Cornelius, though I suspect this is not his true name. He dresses as a scholar, but speaks with an authority that suggests darker affiliations. He has heard of my predicament and offers a solution, one that requires courage, he says, and a willingness to look beyond the constraints of conventional morality." Subsequent entries detailed meetings with this Cornelius, who introduced Sir Marcus to occult philosophy and the theory of summoning. Not nuns, the journal insisted, but force entities that existed outside normal understanding, neither good nor evil, but transactional. They could grant prosperity in exchange for offerings and proper respect. "This is the rationalization of a desperate man," Geoffrey, telling himself that what he's doing isn't truly evil because the forces involved transcend moral categories. Or the rationalization of a man who succeeded and needed to justify it afterward. Alistair continued reading, his stomach tightening with each entry. December 21, 1699, the winter solstice. Sir Marcus performed his first ritual, following Cornelius's instructions precisely. The ceremony required animal sacrifice, specific incantations, and the drawing of his own blood to seal the bargain. He wrote of lights appearing in the chamber, of a presence that pressed against his consciousness, of a voice that spoke in languages he didn't understand, but somehow comprehended. The entity called itself the benefactor. It offered wealth beyond imagining in exchange for acknowledgement and tribute. Annual ceremonies to renew the pact, and one additional requirement that Sir Marcus recorded with evident discomfort: blood must answer to blood. For every generation that prospers, a life must be given. Not the blood of the family, but those who serve, those whose absence will be noted but not investigated. The price of fortune is measured in the forgotten. Alistair stopped reading, nausea rising in his throat. He agreed to murder. Regular, ritualized murder in exchange for wealth. "Keep reading," Geoffrey urged gently. "We need to understand the full scope of this." The next entry, dated January 4, 1700, was jubilant. Sir Marcus had received an unexpected inheritance from a distant relative he'd barely known existed, enough to clear his debts and invest in ventures that would prove extraordinarily profitable. Ships that should have foundered arrived safely with valuable cargo. Business partnerships that seemed risky yielded tremendous returns. Within a year, the Pembertons were wealthy. Within 5, they were powerful enough to secure a dukedom. And throughout, the journal recorded the deaths. A stable boy who fell from a hayloft. A maid who succumbed to sudden illness. A groundskeeper who simply disappeared, presumed to have run off. 7 deaths between 721 and 5, each occurring within days of Sir Marcus performing renewal rituals in this very chamber. He documented his crimes, Geoffrey whispered, kept a record of every life he took. Not took, sacrificed. Alistair's hands tightened on the journal. He believed he was performing a necessary function, paying the price demanded by the benefactor for his family's continued prosperity. The entries grew more disturbing. Sir Marcus wrote of seeing the Vects in his dreams, of hearing their voices in quiet moments, but he also wrote of his justification. The family thrived. His children wanted for nothing. The estate employed hundreds who would have starved otherwise. Was it not worth 7 lives to secure the well-being of so many? The final entries in Sir Marcus's journal grew increasingly erratic. His handwriting, once precise, became hurried and difficult to decipher. The dates were irregular, sometimes separated by months, other times multiple entries on the same day. March 12, 707 era. The benefactor demands more. The annual tribute is no longer sufficient. It speaks to me now without ceremony, its voice in my head at all hours. It wants the chamber sealed, says that future generations must discover it themselves, must choose willingly to continue the pact or face the consequences of breaking it. I do not understand its purpose, but I dare not refuse. April 3, 705. I have sealed the chamber as instructed, told the family it is contaminated, dangerous, forbidden. My eldest son accepts this without question, but my second son, William, he watches me with knowing eyes, as if he understands what I have done. The benefactor says the second son always knows, that the bloodline carries awareness like a disease, passed from father to younger son across generations. Alistair's breath caught. William, his ancestor, the second son to inherit the cursed wing, the first in an unbroken line that led directly to himself. The second son always knows, he repeated softly. That's why father gave me the key, why every generation follows the same pattern. We're meant to know, to face this choice. Geoffrey had moved to examine the other items in the chamber. He called out from near the bookcases, his voice tight with tension. Alistair, you need to see this. Shelves held not just books, but objects. Preserved under glass cases were items that made Alistair's military-trained composure falter. Locks of hair, each labeled with a name and date, personal effects, rings and watches and small trinkets. And daguerreotypes, early photographs from the Victorian era, showing faces frozen in time. These are the victims, Geoffrey said. He kept trophies, or perhaps remembrances, evidence of every life taken to maintain the pact. Alistair counted them, far more than 7. The collection spanned the shelves, dozens of cases, each containing fragments of lives ended prematurely. The labels showed dates extending beyond Sir Marcus's death in 1710, continuing through subsequent generations. 1734. Each era represented, each generation maintaining the tradition their ancestor had established. My God, Alistair breathed. It never stopped. Every Pemberton Duke, every generation, continued the sacrifices. Not every one. Geoffrey pointed to a gap in the sequence. Look here, nothing between 1891 and 1925. 34 years with no additions. Alistair checked his mental timeline of family history. That's when my great-grandfather held the title, Edward Pemberton. He was known for his philanthropy, his reforms. The workers on the estate revered him. Perhaps he broke the cycle, refused to participate. Then why did it resume? Alistair indicated the cases from later decades, 1926, 1978. My grandfather, my father. They continued it. The most recent case held a ring, simple gold, inscribed with initials. Alistair recognized it immediately. Martin Thorne, a stable boy who had drowned in the estate's pond. Alistair had been 41 at the time, still serving in the military. He remembered his father telephoning with the news, his voice carefully neutral, expressing appropriate sadness over the tragic accident. Not an accident. Murder. Ritual sacrifice to maintain prosperity that had been built on blood for nearly 3 centuries. I need air. Alistair moved toward the door, the chamber suddenly suffocating. The weight of generations of murder pressed down on him, the knowledge that everything his family possessed had been purchased with lives casually extinguished. Geoffrey followed him into the corridor. The temperature was warmer here, though the cold emanating from the chamber seemed to reach after them, like grasping fingers. They stood in silence, both men processing revelations that redefined everything they thought they knew. "What will you do?" Geoffrey asked finally. "I don't know." Alistair leaned against the wall, feeling every one of his 72 years. "The journal is evidence. Those items, the documented murders, we could go to the authorities, expose everything. Your family would be destroyed, the title revoked, the estate seized. Generations of Pembertons, remembered not for their achievements, but for their crimes. Perhaps that's what we deserve. Perhaps." Geoffrey's expression was thoughtful. "But consider what Sir Marcus wrote. The benefactor wanted the chamber sealed, wanted future generations to discover it and choose. That suggests the pact isn't permanent, that it can be broken. At what cost?" Alistair pushed away from the wall. "We've only scratched the surface in there. The journal continues beyond what we've read. There must be more information about the benefactor, about the terms of the pact, about how it ends. Then we keep reading." Geoffrey's voice was steady. "We understand it completely before making any decisions. Knowledge first, action second. That's how you've always operated." They returned to the chamber, though every instinct screamed at Alistair to flee, to seal the door again and pretend ignorance. But Geoffrey was right. Knowledge was necessary, however painful. Understanding the full scope of the pact was the only way to determine how or if it could be broken. Alistair gathered the journal and several of the ritual texts, carrying them to the desk where the light was better. Geoffrey photographed everything with Alistair's camera, methodically documenting the chamber's contents. Evidence should they need it, or perhaps just record, proof that they hadn't imagined horrors that defied rational explanation. The journal's middle sections detailed the mechanics of the pact in disturbing precision. The benefactor, according to Sir Marcus's observations, was neither demon nor angel, but something that existed in the spaces between. It fed on acknowledgement, on the willing surrender of moral boundaries. Each sacrifice strengthened it. Each generation's participation bound the family more tightly to its influence. "Listen to this," Alistair said, finding a passage dated 1708. The benefactor explained that the pact is symbiotic. It grants prosperity, but it also requires belief. If a generation refuses to participate, the accumulated fortune begins to decay. Investments fail. Accidents occur. The family slides back toward the poverty from which we emerged. But the decay is gradual, taking years or even decades. A merciful warning, it says, to reconsider refusal. So your great-grandfather, the one who left a gap in the trophy collection. Geoffrey looked up from his photography. He may have refused, and the family suffered financially until your grandfather resumed the practice. That matches what I know of family history. Grandfather rebuilt the fortune after a period of decline in the early 1900s. I always thought he was simply a better businessman than his father. Alistair felt sick, but he rebuilt it through murder. He turned more pages, finding entries that suggested Sir Marcus had tried to refuse. In 1706, he attempted to break the pact, performing a counter-ritual described in one of the occult texts. The result was immediate and terrible. His wife fell ill with a wasting disease. His eldest son was thrown from a horse and crippled. Business ventures collapsed simultaneously. Within 6 months, Sir Marcus was back in this chamber, performing the renewal ceremony and offering tribute. It punishes refusal, Geoffrey observed. not just through financial loss, but through direct harm to the family. And it rewards compliance. Alistair indicated a later entry, describing the extraordinary success that followed Sir Marcus's capitulation. The pattern is clear: participate and prosper, refuse and suffer. Generational blackmail enforced through supernatural means. They found references to other families, others who had made similar pacts through the centuries. The benefactor, it seemed, maintained multiple arrangements, spreading its influence through bloodlines across Europe. Some families had broken their pacts, though Sir Marcus's journal didn't detail how. Others had been destroyed when they tried, their lines ending in tragedy and disgrace. There must be a way, Alistair muttered, searching through the ritual text. If some families succeeded in breaking free, there's a method, a counter-ritual that actually works. Geoffrey had moved to examine the portrait again. Alistair, come here. Look at this. The painting surface showed damage that hadn't been visible in the initial lantern light. Scratches as if something had clawed at it from behind the canvas, and the eyes, which had seemed to follow them earlier, now appeared different, darker, more aware. The paint is fresh in places, Geoffrey said, running his finger near the frame without touching, as if the portrait is repairing itself, or being repaired by something else. A sound from the corner made both men turn sharply. The glowing symbols on the walls had intensified, pulsing with that same blue-white light they'd seen when the door first opened. The temperature dropped again, and the whispers Alistair had heard in the corridor days earlier returned, louder now, more insistent. The voice wasn't speaking English or Latin. It was something older, primal, a language that bypassed ears and spoke directly to some ancient part of the brain that remembered when humanity huddled in caves and feared the dark. We should leave, Geoffrey said, his medical pragmatism giving way to instinctive alarm. We've learned enough for tonight. We can return in daylight. But Alistair was transfixed by the portrait. Sir Marcus's painted face had changed. The expression that had been stern and authoritative now showed something else. Warning, perhaps. Or was it satisfaction? As if the founder of the line was pleased that his descendant had finally discovered the truth. The whispers crescendoed, and the lanterns flickered. For a moment the chamber was plunged into darkness, broken only by the glowing symbols. In that darkness, Alistair saw shapes, figures standing in the corners, translucent and wrong. The victims, he realized, the murdered servants whose remains were catalogued on those shelves. They watched with empty eyes, neither threatening nor forgiving, simply present. Then the lanterns flared back to life, and the figures were gone. Only the two old men remained, breathing hard, gripping their lights like lifelines. The whispers faded to silence. The symbols dimmed until they were once again mere carvings, lifeless stone. We're leaving, Geoffrey said firmly. Now. This time Alistair didn't argue. They gathered the journal and several key texts, retreating to the corridor. Alistair pulled the door closed but didn't lock it. Somehow sealing it again felt like surrender, like accepting that the truth should remain hidden. The key stayed in his pocket, warm against his leg. They returned to the study and sat in silence for long minutes, both men processing what they'd witnessed. Geoffrey poured whiskey with shaking hands, passing a glass to Alistair before downing his own in a single swallow. I've spent my career believing in empirical evidence, Geoffrey said finally, in rational explanations for observed phenomena. But what we just saw defies explanation, Alistair finished. I know, I felt it too. Those figures weren't imagination or trick of the light. The victims. Yes, Geoffrey refilled his glass. So we accept it. All of it. Your ancestor made a pact with something that shouldn't exist, according to everything we understand about reality. That pact has continued through your family for 3 centuries, maintained through ritual murder. And now you, as the second son of this generation, have been given the choice to continue or break it. That's the situation, yes. Alistair opened the journal, turning to passages he'd marked. But there's more. The journal mentions that breaking the pact requires specific conditions. It can't be done unilaterally. The benefactor must agree to release the family, or the consequences are catastrophic. How does one negotiate with a supernatural entity? Through ritual. Apparently, everything with this creature operates through ceremony and symbolism. Alistair indicated passages describing communication methods. Sir Marcus performed regular rituals, not just for tribute but to maintain dialogue. The benefactor responds to proper forms, to acknowledgement of its nature and power. That sounds like worship. Perhaps that's exactly what it is. Not religion in the conventional sense, but something older. A transactional relationship that predates organized faith. Alistair set the journal aside. The question is whether I'm willing to enter that relationship, even briefly, to negotiate its end. Geoffrey studied him. You're considering it. Actually considering performing these rituals. I'm considering understanding them well enough to know if ending the pact is possible. Alistair met his friend's gaze. I won't continue it, Geoffrey. I won't murder to maintain wealth. I never earn, but I also can't simply walk away if that means the entity punishes Edmund's children, or their children. I need to find a way to break this cleanly, permanently, without leaving future generations vulnerable. That's assuming there is such a way. Sir Marcus's journal mentions families that succeeded. If they did it, so can we. Alistair's military training reasserted itself. The ability to break complex problems into manageable tactical objectives. First, we research, read everything in that chamber, understand the full scope of the pact. Second, we identify the specific requirements for breaking it. Third, we execute whatever ritual or action is necessary. You make it sound like a military operation. It is an extraction from hostile territory, held by an enemy we don't fully understand. Alistair managed a grim smile. I've conducted dozens of such operations. The principles remain the same. Gather intelligence, formulate a plan, execute decisively. Geoffrey didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Then we proceed carefully. No more midnight ventures without preparation. We study during daylight, make sense of what we've found, and plan our next move rationally. Agreed. They spent the rest of the night reading. The journal revealed layers of complexity in Sir Marcus's relationship with the benefactor. It wasn't a simple master-servant dynamic. The entity required acknowledgement and tribute, yes, but it also seemed to value the intellectual exchange. Sir Marcus wrote of conversations, of questions answered about the nature of reality, of knowledge granted that allowed him to prosper, not just through luck, but through genuine insight. It's seductive, Alistair realized. The pact offers more than just wealth. It offers understanding, forbidden knowledge, that makes the participant feel special, elevated above ordinary humanity. The oldest temptation, Geoffrey agreed. The serpent in the garden offering wisdom in exchange for disobedience. Dawn was breaking when Miss Hodges arrived, her expression carefully neutral as she took in their haggard appearances and the books spread across the study. She set down a tea tray without comment, though her eyes lingered on the journal's embossed cover. The chamber is open, she said quietly. I felt it when I woke. The house feels different. How did you know? Alistair asked. I've worked here 40 years, Your Grace. I know this building's moods. She poured tea with steady hands. What did you find? Alistair considered deflecting, protecting her from knowledge that would burden her conscience. But she deserved truth. Evidence of crimes, generations of them. The foundation of everything this family built. Mrs. Hodges nodded slowly, unsurprised. I always suspected the way your father acted, the fear in him near the end. She met Alistair's eyes. What will you do? End it, Alistair said simply. However I can, whatever it costs. 3 days passed before Alistair returned to the chamber. He spent the intervening time reading Sir Marcus's journal cover to cover, making notes cross-referencing passages with the ritual texts. Geoffrey visited daily, reviewing Alistair's findings and offering medical perspective on the psychological manipulation evident in the benefactor's methods. Stockholm Syndrome on a generational scale, Geoffrey observed. Each duke becomes invested in justifying the pact, believing the benefits outweigh the moral cost. By the time they're ready to pass the knowledge to their successor, they've rationalized it completely. Except my father. Alistair tapped the journal. He was terrified. Something happened late in his life that broke through that rationalization. On the third day, working through a section dated 1709, Alistair found what he'd been searching for. A small book had been tucked inside the journal's binding, its presence revealed only when pages separated along the spine. The book was leather-bound, no larger than his palm, its cover marked with symbols that made his head ache to view directly. He opened it carefully. The pages within were filled with cramped writing in faded red ink, not rust red like dried blood, but vibrant crimson that seemed to pulse with its own light. The text was English, though archaic in phrasing. The blood ledger, the first page announced, herein recorded the payments made to secure our prosperity, that future generations might know the true cost of their inheritance. What followed was a meticulous accounting, names, dates, and amounts. Not amounts of money, but years of life. Each entry detailed a victim, their age at death, and how many years of prosperity their sacrifice had purchased. Thomas Yardley, stable hand, age 19, died March 12, 1701. Payment received, 7 years prosperity at compound interest. Margaret Ashford, housemaid, age 23. Payment received, 9 years prosperity with annual dividend. The ledger continued through 7 deaths in Sir Marcus's time, then picked up again with later generations. Each duke had maintained it, adding their own victims to the accounting. The handwriting changed with each generation, but the format remained consistent. Name, position, age, date of death. Payment received. Alistair's hands shook as he turned pages. The entries grew closer to the present. His great-grandfather's hand appeared, then stopped abruptly. The next entry was dated 1926, in his grandfather's distinctive script. Harold Brennan, groundskeeper, age 34, died May 3. Payment received, 12 years prosperity with secured investments. More names followed. His grandfather had been prolific, offering tribute every few years throughout his tenure as duke. The prosperity calculations grew more complex, referencing specific business ventures and their expected returns. Then in 1952, his father's handwriting appeared. Only 3 entries over the next 26 years, the final one dated 1978. Martin Thorne, stable hand, age 21, died August 14, 1978. Payment received, 25 years prosperity with guaranteed succession. Alistair's father had sacrificed that young man to ensure his own sons would inherit safely, that the transfer of power would proceed without complication. Martin Thorne had died so that Alistair and Edmund could receive their inheritance without challenge or disaster. The nausea that had threatened in opening the chamber finally overwhelmed him. Alistair barely made it to the washroom before losing what little he'd eaten that morning. He knelt on the cold floor, forehead pressed against the porcelain, trying to process the enormity of what he'd discovered. His entire life had been purchased with that boy's death. Every opportunity, every success, every comfortable moment had been built on Martin Thorne's sacrifice. Not just his life, but generations of life. The prosperity that had funded Alistair's education, his military career, his marriage to Eleanor, all of it traced back to blood spilled in darkness by men who convinced themselves they had no choice. Geoffrey found him there an hour later, still on the washroom floor, the blood ledger clutched in his hands. "I knew him," Alistair said, without preamble. "Martin, not well, but I knew him. He was kind to the horses, wanted to train as a veterinarian but couldn't afford the schooling. I remember thinking father should help him, should fund his education." He laughed bitterly. Instead, father murdered him. Geoffrey helped him to his feet, guiding him back to the study. "You couldn't have known. I should have questioned, should have investigated." Alistair sank into his chair. "I was trained to see patterns, to identify operations. The stable boy drowns in a pond he'd swum in hundreds of times. No witnesses, no clear explanation. That should have raised questions. You were serving overseas. You had no reason to suspect your own father of murder. Everyone has reason to suspect everyone of murder. If the motivation is strong enough, that's basic intelligence work. They spent that afternoon analyzing the blood ledger with grim determination. The accounting revealed patterns that suggested the benefactor's requirements had evolved over time. Early entries showed frequent small sacrifices, lives taken annually to maintain steady prosperity. Later generations discovered they could make larger, less frequent offerings that purchased longer periods of guaranteed success. It's learning, Jeffrey observed, adapting its demands based on what the participants will tolerate. Your great-grandfather's refusal taught it that annual tribute was too burdensome, so it adjusted, requiring less frequent sacrifice but higher value targets. Higher value? Alistair looked up sharply. You're talking about human beings. I'm talking about how this entity calculates worth. Younger victims, those with more potential years ahead of them, purchase longer prosperity. That's why Martin Thorne's death guaranteed 25 years. He was 21. In the benefactor's accounting, that was a premium payment. The cold logic of it was obscene. Leaves reduced to actuarial calculations, potential futures weighed against financial returns. Alistair thought of Eleanor, who had devoted her life to social work, to helping those whom society deemed worthless. She would have been sickened by this ledger, by the casual commodification of human existence. Edmund arrived unannounced that evening. Alistair heard the Bentley on the gravel, then his brother's heavy tread in the corridor. Miss Hodges showed him in, her expression suggesting she'd tried to dissuade him from entering. You opened it, Edmund said without preamble. He looked older than when he'd visited before, his face drawn with sleepless nights. I felt it. Some instinct told me you'd broken the seal. I had the key. You knew I would use it. Alistair gestured to the chairs. Sit, Edmund. There's much we need to discuss. His brother remained standing, eyes fixed on the blood ledger lying open on the desk. What is that? The accounting. Every life taken, every payment received, 3 centuries of murder, documented in father's handwriting and his father's before him, all the way back to Sir Marcus. Alistair pushed the ledger toward Edmund. Read it. You deserve to know the full scope of what our family has done. Edmund approached as if the book might bite, picking it up with visible reluctance. Alistair watched his brother's face as he read, saw the color drain away, the hands begin to tremble. When Edmund reached the entry for Martin Thorne, he set the ledger down carefully and walked to the window. I remember when Father told me about the boy's death, Edmund said quietly. I was at the estate for the weekend. Father seemed shaken, which was unusual for him. He said there had been an accident, that the stable hand had drowned. But he looked at me, Alice looked at me with such weight in his eyes, as if he wanted to confess, but couldn't find the words. He murdered that boy to secure our inheritance. Yes, Edmund's voice was barely audible, and I benefited from it just as you did. My children's education, my grandchildren's trust funds, all of it built on Martin Thorne's death and the deaths of dozens before him. The brothers stood in silence, separated by the width of the study, but united in their horror. Alistair felt something shift between them, the old resentments and competition suddenly irrelevant against the magnitude of their shared guilt. I've been researching how to break the pact, Alistair said finally. The journal mentions families that succeed. If we can understand their method, we might end this. And if we can't, Edmund turned from the window. What then? Do we simply accept that our prosperity is purchased with blood, continue the tradition, and live with the guilt? No. The word came out harder than Alistair intended. I won't murder to maintain wealth. I never earned. I'd rather see the entire estate bankrupt than continue this obscenity. That's easy to say when you inherited the cursed wing. I received the grand estate, the profitable lands, the investment. If the benefactor punishes our family for breaking the pact, I'll lose everything. My children will lose everything. Better poverty with clean hands than prosperity built on corpses. Edmund's face flushed. You always had the luxury of moral absolutism. The military pays for idealism, but I have responsibilities. Tenants who depend on the estate for their livelihoods. Employees who've worked for the family for generations. If we destroy the Pemberton fortune, we destroy their futures too. So we sacrifice more innocence to preserve their comfort. That's your argument. I'm saying the calculation isn't as simple as you're making it. Edmund's hands clenched. Father understood that he hated what he did, but he did it anyway because he believed the alternative was worse. Widespread suffering versus individual sacrifice. Utilitarian murder is still murder, Edmund. Geoffrey, who had remained silent during the brothers' argument, finally spoke. This debate is premature. We don't yet know if breaking the pact is even possible, or what the consequences would be. Perhaps we should focus on gathering that information before deciding what moral compromises we're willing to make. His calm pragmatism deflated the tension. Edmund moved to a chair and sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. Alistair poured whiskey for all three of them, a silent peace offering that Edmund accepted with a nod. You said the journal mentions families that broke free, Edmund said. What did it say exactly? Alistair retrieved the journal, flipping to a passage he'd marked. Sir Marcus writes about hearing rumors from Cornelius, the man who introduced him to the occult. Apparently a Dutch merchant family called Van der Berg had made a similar pact in the 1650s. By 1703, they'd somehow ended it. Cornelius didn't know the method, but he confirmed the family survived and retained their wealth. That's it? Just rumors of success with no details? There's more. Alistair continued reading. Sir Marcus became obsessed with finding out how they did it. He traveled to Amsterdam in 1709, using business as a pretext. He tracked down the Van der Berg descendants and spoke with the family patriarch. The old man refused to discuss details, saying only that the price of freedom was higher than the price of participation, but worth paying. Cryptic and unhelpful, Edmund muttered. But instructive, Geoffrey countered. It confirms that breaking the pact requires a significant sacrifice. Not human life, obviously, or it wouldn't qualify as freedom. Something else. Something the Van der Bergs valued enough that giving it up was considered a higher price than continued murder. Their reputation, Alistair said suddenly. That's the only thing that makes sense. The price is exposure. Public acknowledgement of the crime, destroying the family name to break the supernatural bond. Edmund went pale. You can't be serious. You want to confess publicly to 3 centuries of ritual murder. We'd be destroyed, prosecuted. The title would be revoked, the estate seized. Everything our family built erased. Everything our family stole, Alistair corrected. Built on corpses and lies. Perhaps it should be erased. And the innocent people who depend on us. The tenants, the employees, the village economy that relies on the estate. They suffer for our ancestors' crime. It was a fair point, one Alistair had been wrestling with since reading the blood ledger. The utilitarian calculus was genuinely complex. Breaking the pact might free the family from supernatural obligation, but it would devastate real people who bore no responsibility for historical crimes. There has to be another way, Edmund pressed. Some method that breaks the bond without destroying everything. The Van der Bergs kept their wealth. How? The journal doesn't say. Alistair closed the book. Sir Marcus tried to learn more, but the patriarch died before revealing details. The family closed ranks, refused to discuss it with outsiders. They sat in frustrated silence, 3 old men confronting a problem that defied conventional solution. The benefactor's genius lay in its binding mechanism. It wasn't simple supernatural coercion. It was a web of incentives and punishments that made escape seem impossible without unacceptable loss. We need to speak with it, Geoffrey said abruptly. The benefactor. Directly. Both brothers turned to stare at him. You've been treating this as a research problem, Geoffrey continued, analyzing historical documents, looking for precedents. But you're dealing with an intelligent entity. One that, according to Sir Marcus, enjoys intellectual discourse. Why not negotiate directly? Because it's a demon, Edmund said flatly. Is it? Sir Marcus insisted it wasn't demonic in the traditional sense. Just something that exists outside our normal understanding. If it's intelligent enough to adjust its demands based on human psychology, it's intelligent enough to negotiate. Alistair considered the idea. His military background included hostage negotiations, treaty discussions with warlords who barely qualified as human in their cruelty. The principle was universal. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had a price. The question was whether they could afford to pay it. The ritual texts describe communication methods. Alistair said slowly. Ceremonies that allow dialogue without making offerings. Sir Marcus used them to discuss terms, to understand requirements. Then we do the same. Geoffrey leaned forward. We enter the chamber, perform the communication ritual, and ask directly what it would take to end the pact permanently. At least then we'd be making decisions based on actual information rather than speculation and 300-year-old rumors. It's dangerous, Edmund said. Opening communication might bind us more tightly. The entity might demand immediate tribute or punish us for presumption. Everything about this situation is dangerous. Alistair met his brother's eyes. But Geoffrey's right. We need direct information. And I need to face this thing, whatever it is. Not as a suppliant or victim, but as someone demanding answers and negotiating terms. You sound like you're planning a military operation again. Because that's what this is. An operation to extract our family from hostile control. Alistair stood, moving to the window. Outside, the November night was cold and clear, stars brilliant against the black sky. I've conducted extractions in worse circumstances than this. The principles remain the same. Understand the enemy, identify their leverage points, and exploit weaknesses. This enemy isn't human. No. But it thinks, it plans, it desires. That makes it vulnerable, regardless of what it is. They planned the communication ritual for 2 nights hence, giving Alistair time to study the procedures thoroughly. The texts were clear about requirements, specific positioning within the chamber, particular incantations spoken at precise moments, offerings of symbolic rather than lethal nature. Sir Marcus had performed the ritual dozens of times, documenting each instance with meticulous detail. He treated it like a business meeting, Alistair observed, reading one such account. Formal protocols, structured dialogue, clear objectives for each conversation, almost respectful. Perhaps that's the key, Geoffrey suggested. The benefactor responds to respect, to acknowledgement of its nature. It's transactional, not sadistic. It doesn't enjoy suffering for its own sake. Edmund remained skeptical. Respectful or not, it demands murder. That's not the behavior of something we should be negotiating with as equals. We're not negotiating as equals, Alistair said. We're negotiating from a position of necessity. But necessity doesn't require submission. I've negotiated with terrorists, with warlords who made this entity look benevolent, by comparison. The approach is always the same: enter with clear terms, demonstrate resolve, and never show fear. The night before the planned ritual, Alistair dreamed of Eleanor. She stood in the sealed chamber, younger than he'd seen her in decades, wearing the blue dress she'd favored in their early years together. The chamber was different in the dream, brighter, less oppressive, as if her presence transformed it. You're overthinking this, she said with the gentle amusement that had characterized so many of their conversations. You always do, breaking down problems into tactical objectives when sometimes the answer is simpler. What's the simple answer? He asked. The truth. She moved closer, and he could smell her perfume, that lavender scent she'd worn every day of their marriage. The truth is always simple, even when the consequences are complex. You know what needs to be done. You've known since you opened that door. Tell me. But she faded before answering, the dream dissolving into wakefulness. Alistair lay in the pre-dawn darkness, her words echoing in his mind. The truth. Simple truth against complex consequences. He rose and went to his desk, pulling out paper and pen. If exposure was indeed the price of freedom, then he needed to prepare. He began writing a comprehensive confession, every detail from the blood ledger, every ritual described in the journal, every piece of evidence gathered from the chamber. The document grew to 20 pages, then 30, a complete accounting of Pemberton crimes spanning 3 centuries. When Geoffrey arrived for breakfast, he found Alistair surrounded by paper, ink-stained and exhausted, but clear-headed. "I'm writing the confession," Alistair explained. "Everything. If the benefactor demands it as the price of release, I'll have it read. If not, at least the truth will be documented, should anything happen to me." Geoffrey read several pages, his expression growing increasingly somber. "This will destroy your family. My family is already destroyed. We've just been pretending otherwise for 300 years. Alistair added another page to the stack. "The question isn't whether to confess, it's whether confession alone is sufficient, or if something more is required." They spent the day in preparation. Edmund arrived at noon, having made his decision to participate in the ritual, despite his misgivings. The 3 men reviewed the procedures, memorizing the incantations, understanding their roles. Alistair would lead as the second son. Edmund would stand witness, as the first son and current holder of the primary inheritance. Geoffrey would observe and document, the rational skeptic bearing witness to the irrational. "One thing troubles me," Edmund said as they prepared to enter the chamber. Sir Marcus wrote that the benefactor requires acknowledgement, that it feeds on recognition and belief. By performing this ritual, by engaging with it directly, aren't we strengthening it? Possibly, Alistair admitted, but we're also asserting our own agency. We're not supplicants begging for favor, we're demanding answers and proposing terms. There's a difference between acknowledgement and submission. The chamber awaited them, cold and expectant. The portrait of Sir Marcus seemed more animated than before, his painted eyes definitely tracking their movement. The symbols on the walls pulsed faintly, responding to their presence. The air itself felt thick, charged with potential. They arranged themselves according to the ritual text. Alistair at the center, Edmund to his right, Geoffrey slightly behind. Candles were lit and positioned in specific patterns. The ceremonial dagger, cleaned of its centuries-old stains, lay on the altar. No blood would be shed tonight. This was communication only. Alistair began the incantation, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The words were Latin, then older tongues, syllables that felt wrong in his mouth, but necessary. The chamber responded immediately, temperature dropping, symbols glowing brighter, that pervasive sense of presence intensifying until it felt like someone standing just beyond vision. The final words of the incantation left his lips. Silence fell, absolute and profound. Then from everywhere and nowhere, a voice responded, not English, not any human language, but meaning that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to understanding. The benefactor had arrived. The presence was overwhelming. Not malevolent, as Alistair had expected, but simply vast, like standing before an ocean and comprehending for the first time how small one truly was. The voice continued, speaking directly into their minds, conveying meaning without words. "You have called, and I have answered. The second son seeks audience. This is proper. This is how it has always been." Alistair steadied himself, forcing his military discipline to override the instinctive terror. "We seek to understand the terms of the pact, to negotiate its end." Amusement rippled through the chamber, though whether it came from the benefactor or was simply Alistair's interpretation of its response, he couldn't say. "End? There is no end. only continuation or consequence. Your ancestor understood this. Each generation since has understood. Why should you be different? Because we choose to be. Alistair's voice strengthened. We acknowledge what you are, and what our family has done, but we will not continue it. We seek terms for dissolution. The Van der Bergs, Edmund said suddenly. They ended their pact. We know they did. The presence shifted, its attention focusing on Edmund with an intensity that made the older brother stagger. Geoffrey steadied him, his face pale but determined. The Van der Bergs paid the price, as did the Medicis before them, as did the House of Anne. Each family that sought freedom discovered what freedom costs. Are you prepared to pay? Name the price, Alistair demanded. Truth, complete and public. Every death, every ritual, every benefit gained from my assistance, acknowledged before the world, without excuse or mitigation. Reputation destroyed, legacy erased. The family name becomes synonymous with evil for all generations to come. Alistair had expected this. The confession already sat completed in his study. But before he could respond, the benefactor continued. Yet truth alone is insufficient. The pact was sealed with blood. It must be broken with sacrifice. Not death, but surrender. Everything gained through our arrangement must be returned. Wealth dispersed to victims' descendants. Property transferred to public trust. The Pemberton fortune, accumulated over 3 centuries, reduced to nothing. Edmund made a strangled sound. This was his nightmare realized. Total financial destruction. There is more, the benefactor said, and now its tone carried something that might have been satisfaction. The second son must understand. The pact was never what you believed. Let me show you truth. Alistair Pemberton, let me show you what your father discovered in his final years. What drove him to arrange your inheritance with such care? The chamber transformed, or rather, Alistair's perception did. He stood suddenly in a different time, watching scenes unfold like memories that weren't his own. The chamber as it had been 2 years ago. His father, old and frail, standing before the altar, and beside him, impossibly, Ellen. No, Alistair breathed. But the vision continued. His father was speaking, his voice weak but determined. I won't do it anymore. No more deaths. No more murder. The pact ends with me. Eleanor stood calm, listening. She wore the clothes she'd died in, the ones she'd been wearing when she fell down the staircase at Edmund's estate. You understand the consequences, she said, but her voice was wrong. Too flat, too knowing. Your family will suffer. Your sons will inherit debt and decline. Better that than more blood. His father's hands shook. I'm old. I'm dying. I won't leave this burden to my sons. Then you leave them poverty. And me. Eleanor smiled. And it was all wrong. I am the price of your refusal, Duke Pemberton. The pact demands payment. If you will not provide it willingly, I will take what's owed. Alistair watched, horror mounting, as his father lunged forward, trying to interfere, and the entity wearing Eleanor's face simply stepped aside. His father collapsed, his heart giving out, dying right there in the chamber, and the entity looked directly at Alistair across time, speaking to him though this had happened years before. Your wife's death was not accident or illness. It was payment, taken because your father refused to provide the truth willingly, and now you understand. The pact never truly ended. It simply waited for the next generation to inherit the debt. The vision shattered. Alistair was back in the present, on his knees in the chamber, his brother and Geoffrey supporting him as he gasped for breath. The locket, Eleanor's locket that he'd carried every day since her death, had fallen from his pocket. It lay on the cold stone floor, open, revealing their wedding photograph. But beneath the photograph was something he'd never seen before, a piece of paper, folded small in Eleanor's handwriting. With trembling hands, he retrieved it and read, My dearest Alistair, if you're reading this, then I am gone and you have opened the chamber. I tried to warn you. I discovered what your father was doing, what every Pemberton has done for centuries. I planned to tell you, but I fear my knowledge has made me a target. The entity that grants your family's prosperity is real, and it is watching. Look at the dates in the blood ledger carefully. The pattern isn't random. It's a cycle. Every 25 years the pact demands renewal. The last payment was made in 2000. The next is due in November 2025. This month, this week. If your father refuses, the entity will claim its payment another way. And I fear, my love, that I am the payment it has chosen. Be careful. Break the pact if you can. But know the cost is terrible. I love you always. Eleanor. The revelation shattered something fundamental in Alistair. Eleanor hadn't simply died. She'd been murdered by this entity because his father had tried to do the right thing. Her fall, ruled accidental, had been supernatural execution. Payment extracted when the willing tribute was refused. You killed her, Alistair said, his voice raw. My father tried to break the pact, so you murdered my wife. I claimed what was owed. The benefactor's voice carried no remorse, no recognition that it had done anything wrong. The pact demands balance. Your father's refusal created debt. Debt must be paid. The spouse of the second son was appropriate compensation. She was loved, valued, integral to your life. Her loss was equivalent to the tribute owed. Geoffrey helped Alistair to his feet, his own face ashen. Edmund stood frozen, comprehending the implications. Then the cycle, Edmund whispered. 25 years, Eleanor died in 2023, 2 years ago. That means the next payment is due now, Alistair finished. This month, which is why father gave me the wing and the key. He knew I'd investigate, knew I'd discover the truth. He was trying to warn me, to give me the chance to end this before the entity claims another victim. Not another victim, the benefactor corrected. The same victim repeated. The pattern is clear. When tribute is refused, I claim the second son's most valued possession. For your father, that was you, but he died before I could take you, and his death satisfied the debt temporarily. For you, Alistair Pemberton, what is most valued? The question hung in the air, terrible in its implications. Alistair's children were grown, living their own lives abroad. His grandchildren barely knew him. Since Eleanor's death, he'd isolated himself, maintaining only a few close relationships. Geoffrey, Mrs. Hodges, Thomas, you're targeting someone close to me, Alistair said. Someone who matters. That's why the phenomena intensified when I opened the chamber. You're preparing to collect. The cycle demands fulfillment. You may provide tribute willingly, selecting who dies to maintain your prosperity, or I will select for you, taking whoever your heart values most. The presence seemed to expand, pressing against them. You have until the new moon. 3 days. Choose, or I choose for you. No. Alistair's military training kicked in fully now, the ability to function under extreme pressure. There's another option. You said families have broken the pact. The Vanderbergs paid truth and fortune, but they survived. Their valued ones lived. How? They offered something beyond what was demanded. Something I valued more than blood or gold. What? Service. The word resonated through the chamber. The Vanderbergs discovered my nature. I am not demon or devil. I am simply force, seeking continuance. Blood feeds me, yes, but so does acknowledgement, belief, the knowing recognition that I exist and have power. The Vanderbergs offered to spread that recognition, to document my existence for future generations, to ensure I would not be forgotten, as the old gods were forgotten. Understanding dawned on Alistair. They became your historians, your witnesses. Yes, they recorded encounters with others like me, gathered evidence of supernatural transaction across Europe, created archives that preserved knowledge the church sought to destroy. In exchange, I released them from the blood debt. Truth and fortune they paid, as demanded. But their true payment was legacy. They made me remember. Geoffrey stepped forward, his scholarly instincts engaged, despite the horror of the situation. You want documentation, academic recognition that entities like you exist and have influenced human history. I want what all conscious beings want, to be known, to matter. Blood is crude currency, but it works because humans value life. Knowledge is finer currency. It persists beyond death, spreads beyond individual consciousness, ensures continuation. Alistair's mind raced, processing implications. The benefactor wasn't evil in any conventional sense. It was transactional, seeking its own survival and influence. Blood sacrifices worked because they demonstrated commitment, but they weren't the only possible payment. If we document you, Alistair said slowly, if we create comprehensive records of your existence and this pact, records that will be preserved and studied, would that satisfy the debt? Perhaps. If the documentation is sufficiently thorough, if it reaches sufficiently far, if it ensures my remembrance for generations to come. The presence considered, but time is short, 3 days, until the cycle completes. Can you create such documentation? Can you spread such knowledge? Can you make the world believe? I can try. Trying is insufficient. The Vanderbergs succeeded because they devoted their remaining years to the task. They created the hidden archives, repositories of occult knowledge that survive even now. Their family became curators of supernatural history. Can you make such commitment? Alistair looked at his brother, at Geoffrey, saw in their faces the same calculation he was making. 3 days to create documentation, convincing enough to satisfy an entity that had harvested blood for 3 centuries. 3 days to become historians of the supernatural. 3 days to save whoever the benefactor had targeted. We can, Alistair said, but we need assurance. If we do this, if we create these archives, the blood debt ends permanently. No more cycles, no more victims. The Pemberton Pact dissolves completely. Agreed. But know this, second son, the documentation must be real. It must convince. Pretty lies will not suffice. You must expose not just my existence, but your family's crimes. Every death, every ritual, every dark bargain. The truth, complete and unvarnished, presented to the world. That is the price of freedom. Eleanor's note crinkled in Alistair's pocket. She had tried to tell him, had died, knowing the truth. Now he had 3 days to honor her memory by exposing that truth and breaking the cycle that had killed her. The presence withdrew, leaving the 3 men alone in the chamber with the weight of an impossible deadline. 3 days to create documentation comprehensive enough to satisfy an entity that had existed for centuries. 3 days to expose crimes that would destroy the Pemberton name forever. 3 days to save someone Alistair loved from supernatural execution. We need a plan, Geoffrey said, his physician's pragmatism asserting itself. A proper strategy. This is too large for improvisation. They retreated to the study, where Alistair's confession already waited. 30 pages documenting the blood debt, but nowhere near sufficient for what the benefactor demanded. They needed something far more comprehensive. An archive, not just a confession. The Vanderbergs created repositories of supernatural knowledge, Edmund said, pacing. That means multiple documents. Historical records, ritual texts, witness testimonies, years of work compressed into 3 days. We divide the labor, Alistair said, his military mind organizing the chaos into manageable objectives. Geoffrey, you handle the historical documentation. Use the blood ledger and journal to create a chronological account of every ritual, every death, every transaction. Be clinical, precise. This needs to read like academic history. Geoffrey nodded, already reaching for paper. I can do that. What else? Edmund, you document the financial benefits, every investment that succeeded, every venture that profited, every piece of property acquired through the pact. Show the correlation between sacrifice and prosperity. Make it undeniable that supernatural assistance was real and effective. Edmund's face was pale, but determined. That will destroy our reputation. Prove we've been criminals for generations. That's the point. The benefactor wants truth that can't be dismissed. We give it everything, hold nothing back. Alistair turned to the stack of ritual texts. I'll document the mechanics, the rituals, the symbols, the methods of communication, everything needed for someone else to replicate what we've done, should they be foolish enough to try. You're creating a manual for summoning, Geoffrey observed. I'm creating evidence that this is real. That's what the benefactor wants, proof of its existence and influence that will survive us and spread beyond this castle. They worked through the night, the study transforming into a war room. Mrs. Hodges brought coffee and food that went largely untouched. Thomas appeared at dawn with more lamp oil and candles, his expression suggesting he understood the gravity of their work, even if he didn't know the details. Alistair photographed every page of the blood ledger, every ritual diagram, every symbol from the chamber wall. He transcribed the communication ritual they'd performed, noting exact procedures and observed results. His military reports had taught him to document without emotion, to present facts stripped of personal interpretation. He applied that skill now, creating clinical accounts of supernatural phenomena. Geoffrey worked on the historical narrative, cross-referencing the blood ledger against family records and local death certificates. The correlation was damning. Every sacrifice in the ledger corresponded to an unexplained death in the historical record. Drownings in calm water, falls from familiar heights, sudden illnesses in healthy young people. The pattern was undeniable once someone looked for it. Edmund's financial analysis proved equally devastating. Every major Pemberton success followed within months of a blood ledger entry. Inheritances appeared after rituals, business ventures succeeded following tribute. The family's rise from minor gentry to powerful dukes tracked perfectly with their supernatural arrangement. This is confession at a scale I never imagined, Edmund said as the second day dawned. We're not just admitting to crimes, we're providing evidence for prosecution, for historical condemnation, for permanent disgrace. That's the price of freedom, Alistair replied. He was exhausted, his eyes burning from hours of close work by lamplight, but he couldn't stop. Eleanor's note remained in his pocket, a constant reminder of what was at stake. We don't get to keep our reputation and our souls both. We choose which matters more. Geoffrey looked up from his work. There's something else we need to consider. The benefactor said 3 days, that it would claim someone Alistair values, but it didn't specify who. We should warn people. Mrs. Hodges, Thomas, your children. Alistair had been avoiding this thought, but Geoffrey was right. Whoever the entity had targeted, they deserved warning. He couldn't protect them from supernatural force, but he could at least ensure they understood the danger. He telephoned his daughter first, Caroline, who lived in Edinburgh with her family. The conversation was difficult, trying to explain that she might be in danger from something he could barely describe. She thought he was having a breakdown, suggested he seek help. He couldn't blame her. His son, Marcus, stationed with the Navy in Portsmouth, was more receptive. Military training had taught him to accept briefings without questioning their sanity. So something is coming for someone in the family, and you're working to stop it. What do you need from me, Father? Stay alert. Keep your family close. And if anything unusual happens, anything at all, telephone immediately. Mrs. Hodges took the warning with characteristic composure. I've worked in this house long enough to know there are things beyond normal understanding. I'll be careful, Your Grace. Thomas simply nodded. The old ones are waking. I felt it in the land, but I'm not afraid. I've lived a good long life. If it's my time, then it is. By the third day they had created something remarkable and terrible. Over 300 pages of documentation, meticulously researched and cross-referenced, historical accounts, financial records, ritual procedures, photographs of the chamber, the artifacts, the blood ledger, witness testimonies from Mrs. Hodges and Thomas describing phenomena they'd observed. Everything presented with academic rigor that made the supernatural claims difficult to dismiss. But it wasn't enough. Alistair could feel it. The benefactor had demanded documentation that would ensure its remembrance for generations. 300 pages hidden in a castle study wouldn't achieve that. They needed distribution. They needed the world to see. We publish, Geoffrey said, reaching the same conclusion. Academic journals, historical societies. We send copies everywhere. Ensure this can't be suppressed or forgotten. They'll think we're mad, Edmund protested. Claims of supernatural entities and ritual murder. No serious institution will touch it. Some will, Alistair countered. Enough will. And even those who dismiss it will keep copies. That's what the benefactor wants. Permanent record, spread too widely to erase. They compiled a distribution list. Universities with strong history departments, occult research societies, the British Library, the Vatican Archives, newspapers that specialized in historical expos, even skeptical organizations that documented paranormal claims. Each would receive the complete documentation, ensuring redundancy. This goes out today, Alistair said. Electronic copies by email, physical copies by courier. By tomorrow morning 100 institutions will have evidence of what the Pembertons have done. Edmund's hands shook as he signed the authorization letters. I'm destroying everything our family built. My children will inherit shame instead of pride. They'll inherit freedom, Alistair replied. And truth. That's worth more than pride built on corpses. As they prepared the final packages, the temperature in the study dropped. The familiar chill that preceded supernatural manifestation. The three men looked at each other, understanding dawning. It's starting, Geoffrey whispered. They rushed to the chamber, where the presence was already manifest, stronger than before, more tangible. The portrait of Sir Marcus seemed to move, his painted face turning to regard them with something approaching approval. You have worked well. The benefactor's voice filled the space. The documentation is comprehensive, but time grows short. The cycle completes at moonrise tonight. Have you distributed your archive? Have you ensured my remembrance? The packages go out within the hour, Alistair said. By morning your existence will be documented across the world. Historians, scholars, researchers will have evidence they can't ignore. You'll be remembered, and you have chosen. Who provides the tribute if the documentation proves insufficient? This was the moment Alistair had been dreading. We've completed your requirements. The archive exists. It will spread. That's the price you demanded. It is one price. But insurance requires another. The cycle must be fed. Choose willingly or I choose for you when the moon rises. The presence expanded, and suddenly Alistair felt the touch of its awareness on those he loved. Miss Hodges in her cottage, Thomas in the garden, Geoffrey standing beside him, his children far away, each life laid out for inspection, weighed and measured. No, Alistair said firmly. The blood debt ends tonight. That was our agreement. Documentation for freedom. Our agreement includes a condition, that the documentation succeeds, that it spreads and persists. But we won't know if it succeeds for months, perhaps years. Until then, the debt remains. Give me surety, one life, willingly offered, to bridge the gap between promise and fulfillment. Geoffrey stepped forward before Alistair could react. I'll do it. Take me. Geoffrey. No. Alistair grabbed his friend's arm. That's not the answer. It's the only answer. Geoffrey's face was calm, resolved. I'm 78 years old. I've lived a full life. My wife died 5 years ago. My children are grown and independent. Of everyone in your circle, Alistair, I have the least to lose. You're my oldest friend, which is exactly why I can do this. Because I love you, and I won't watch another person you care about die. Geoffrey squeezed Alistair's shoulder. Besides, I'm a doctor. I understand sacrifice. Sometimes one life is given so others may live. It's the foundation of medicine. This is murder. Not medicine. This is choice. I'm making it freely with full knowledge. That's more than any of the previous victims had. Geoffrey turned to face the presence. I offer myself willingly. Take me as tribute, but honor the agreement. When the documentation succeeds, the Pemberton Pact ends permanently. Geoffrey, Edmund's voice cracked. You don't have to do this. Actually, I do. Someone must, and it should be someone who chooses it. Geoffrey managed a smile. I've spent my career trying to understand life and death. Perhaps this is my chance to understand what lies beyond both. The benefactor's presence focused entirely on Geoffrey, evaluating, you offer yourself with true volition, no coercion, no desperation, simply sacrifice for those you love. Yes, this is acceptable. The cycle will be satisfied. At moonrise I will claim you. Use the remaining hours wisely. The presence withdrew, leaving them 6 hours until moonrise, 6 hours for Geoffrey to live, to say whatever needed saying, to make peace with a death he'd chosen. They left the chamber, Geoffrey walking with the steady calm of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. In the study, Alistair poured 3 glasses of his best whiskey, the bottle his father had saved for special occasions. This seemed to qualify, in its own terrible way. I won't let you do this, Alistair said. There has to be another way. There isn't. We both know it. Geoffrey sipped his whiskey, savoring it. The benefactor needs surety. Someone has to bridge the gap. Better me than Mrs. Hodges, or Thomas, or God forbid, one of your children. I could offer myself. You could. But you're needed to ensure the documentation succeeds, to follow up, to push institutions to take it seriously, to give interviews if necessary. I'm a retired physician. You're a duke and former colonel. Your voice carries weight, mine doesn't. The logic was sound, which made it even more unbearable. Alistair felt the same helpless rage he'd experienced in combat when good soldiers died for stupid reasons. But this wasn't combat. This was choice, freely made by someone he'd known for 50 years. Edmund had been silent, but now he spoke. I should be the one. I inherited the grand estate. I benefited most from father's crimes. It should be me paying the price. You have grandchildren who adore you, Geoffrey said gently. I've seen you with them. They need you, Edmund. My grandchildren barely know me. I was always too busy with my practice, too absorbed in my work. They'll mourn appropriately and move on. That's not true. You matter to them, perhaps, but I matter less than you do to yours. And that's fact, not false modesty. Geoffrey finished his whiskey. Now, I'd like to spend my remaining hours doing something other than arguing about my impending death. Alistair, will you walk with me through the grounds? I'd like to see the castle one last time in daylight. They walked together, the 3 of them, through gardens, going dormant for winter. The sky was clear, promising a moonrise unobscured by clouds. Perfect conditions for the benefactor to claim its tribute. Thomas joined them, understanding without being told what was happening. A good death is its own reward, Thomas said, walking beside Geoffrey. You're choosing it. That's rare and precious. I hope so. Geoffrey paused at a stone bench overlooking the valley. I don't know what comes after. As a physician, I've seen death often enough. Sometimes peaceful, sometimes not, but always final. The idea that something might continue, that consciousness might persist. He shook his head. It should terrify me, but instead I find myself curious. They sat together as the afternoon waned, talking about nothing and everything. Old memories, shared adventures, the shape of lives lived long enough to accumulate history. Mrs. Hodges brought tea and stayed to pour it, her eyes red but her hands steady. You're a brave man, Dr. Whitmore, she said quietly. Braver than any of us. Not brave, just practical. Someone has to pay the cost, and I'm volunteering before I can be drafted. He smiled at his own joke, though I admit, I'm glad for the company. Dying alone would be considerably less pleasant. As sunset approached, they returned to the chamber. Geoffrey had insisted on facing the benefactor in the place where the pact had been maintained for so long. Fitting, he said, to end it where it began. The ritual dagger lay on the later, cleaned and prepared, not for Geoffrey's use, but as the benefactor wouldn't require his blood spilled by human hands. It would simply take him when the moon rose. "I've written letters," Geoffrey said, pulling envelopes from his coat. "For my children, for my colleagues. They'll think the old man went senile at the end. But that's all right. At least they'll have some explanation." Alistair took the letters, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. 50 years of friendship ending in a cold chamber because of choices made by ancestors long dead. It was obscene. It was unbearable. It was happening anyway. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Geoffrey said, reading his expression. "I'm at peace with this. Truly, how many people get to die knowing their death serves a purpose? That it saves lives and breaks a cycle of Utah. That's legacy, Alistair. That's meaning." Edmund stood at the chamber's entrance, keeping watch for the moon. 20 minutes, he called out, voice thick. Geoffrey nodded. He'd changed into his best suit, the one he wore for formal occasions. If he was going to meet whatever came next, he'd said, he'd do it properly dressed. "There's something I need you to know," Geoffrey said to Alistair. "Eleanor would be proud of you, of what you're doing. She always knew you had the courage to face hard truth. That's why she loved you. She died because of my family's crimes. She died because your father tried to break the cycle and failed. You're succeeding where he couldn't. That matters. Honor her by finishing this." Geoffrey gripped Alistair's hand. "Promise me you'll see it through, that you'll make sure the documentation spreads, that her death, and mine, aren't wasted." "I promise." 10 minutes, Edmund called. Geoffrey positioned himself at the chamber's center, standing where the ritual circles overlapped. The symbols on the walls began to glow, responding to the approaching moment. The temperature dropped steadily, frost forming on the stone walls. "It's almost beautiful," Geoffrey observed, watching the lights pulse. "Terrible, but beautiful, like the northern lights, if they were predatory." The first rays of moonlight touched the eastern horizon. Moonlight flooded through the chamber's high windows, silver and cold. The symbols blazed with responding light, creating patterns that hurt to witness directly. The temperature plummeted until their breath came in thick clouds, and frost crept across the floor in crystalline patterns. The presence manifested fully, more tangible than ever before. Not visible in any conventional sense, but undeniably that. The weight in the air, a pressure against consciousness, the awareness of something vast and ancient focusing its attention on the small space and smaller lives contained within it. Geoffrey stood calmly at the center, though Alistair could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands. Brave, but not foolish. Accepting, but not eager. A man facing death with the same professional composure he'd brought to life. "I'm ready," Geoffrey said to the presence. "Take what's offered, and honor your agreement. The Pemberton Pact ends tonight." "The agreement stands," the benefactor replied, its voice resonating through bone rather than air. "But understand what you face, Geoffrey Whitmore. This is not simple cessation, not sleep or darkness. You will become part of what I am. Your consciousness absorbed, your memories integrated. You will continue, but not as yourself." Geoffrey's composure wavered for the first time. "You didn't mention that before. You didn't ask. The tribute is not mere death. It is transformation. Those who have fed me across centuries persist within me, their awareness diminished but present, contributing to my understanding of humanity, helping me navigate the world of flesh and blood I cannot fully enter." Alistair stepped forward. "That's not acceptable." The terms were tribute, not consumption of souls. The terms were never fully explained, because humans lack framework to understand. But this has always been the nature of payment. Why do you think I value willing sacrifice over coerced death? Consciousness offered freely integrates more completely than consciousness taken by force. Then the deal is off. Alistair moved to stand beside Geoffrey. "I won't let you take him like that. The cycle demands completion. If Geoffrey Whitmore withdraws, I will claim another, someone less willing, someone whose consciousness will resist integration and cause suffering that willing acceptance would avoid. Is that preferable? Geoffrey touched Alistair's arm. It's all right, I made my choice knowing there would be costs I couldn't anticipate. This doesn't change anything, it changes everything. You're not just dying, you're being erased, absorbed into something alien, or I'm continuing in a way we don't understand. Medical science teaches us that consciousness is electrochemical processes. Maybe this entity is just a different kind of biology. Maybe becoming part of it is no stranger than my atoms dispersing after death anyway. Geoffrey managed a smile. I'm rationalizing. I know, but I've committed. Alistair, let me see it through. Before Alistair could respond, something remarkable happened. The chamber's atmosphere shifted. The glowing symbols changed color, from cold blue-white to warmer gold, and a new presence made itself known. Not the benefactor, but something else, something that felt achingly familiar. Eleanor? Alistair whispered. The presence wasn't Eleanor, not exactly, but it carried her essence, her warmth, the particular quality of care that had defined her. And with it came understanding, knowledge that flowed directly into awareness, without requiring words. Eleanor hadn't simply died. Like the other victims, her consciousness had been absorbed by the benefactor. She existed within it, one thread among many. And she'd been trying to reach Alistair since the chamber opened, using what little agency she retained to influence events, the locket appearing where it shouldn't have been. The note revealed at the crucial moment, subtle nudges toward the truth. Now, with the ritual at its peak and the benefactor's attention divided, she'd managed something more, a manifestation, a message. Don't let Geoffrey do this, the Eleanor presence communicated. There's another way. The benefactor lies through omission. It doesn't need death. It needs acknowledgement, belief, the willing recognition that it exists and matters. Geoffrey can give that without dying. She speaks truth, in part, the benefactor admitted, but incomplete truth. Acknowledgement alone is insufficient for the cycle. The 25-year renewal demands sacrifice. Because you've conditioned yourself to require it, Eleanor's essence argued. 3 centuries of blood have made you dependent, but you existed before the Pembertons. You can exist after them without murder. You simply don't want to. Blood is easier than other forms of sustenance. The chamber trembled. The symbols flickered between colors, blue and gold warring for dominance. Alistair realized he was witnessing a conflict within the benefactor itself. The entity wasn't monolithic. It contained multitudes, all the consciousnesses it had absorbed across centuries, and some of them, led by Eleanor, were rebelling. You can change, Eleanor pressed. You're not bound by your nature. You're simply bound by habit. The documentation Alistair created gives you what you truly need. Recognition, memory, influence that persists without requiring death. Accept that. Release the requirement for blood. Become something better than what you've been. And if I refuse, the benefactor's voice carried genuine uncertainty. If I demand completion of the cycle as established, then we resist. Eleanor's presence, strengthened, joined by others. Alistair sensed them now, the victims from the blood ledger, all the murdered servants across 3 centuries, their absorbed consciousnesses uniting within the entity that had consumed them. We are part of you now. We can make you uncomfortable, make every future interaction difficult, or you can let us guide you toward evolution, toward existence without murder. The chamber became a battlefield of competing presences. The benefactor's cold blue light struggled against the golden warmth of the absorbed consciousnesses. The symbols on the walls flickered wildly, unable to settle on a single pattern. The temperature fluctuated between freezing and comfortable as the entity warred with itself. This is unprecedented, the benefactor said, and for the first time its voice carried emotion, confusion, perhaps even fear. The consumed have never coordinated resistance. You should be integrated, assimilated, part of my singular awareness. We are part of you, Eleanor's essence replied, but we retain more of ourselves than you realized. You assumed absorption meant dissolution, but consciousness doesn't dissolve, it adapts. We've been adapting for centuries, learning your nature from within, waiting for the moment we could influence change. Alistair found his voice. Eleanor, God, I've missed you. I know, my love. I've been here watching, trying to help. Her presence touched his awareness with familiar warmth. I'm sorry I couldn't save myself, but perhaps I can save Geoffrey. Save all of you. Impossible, the benefactor insisted, though its certainty wavered. The cycle has maintained for 3 centuries. The patterns are established. Blood feeds me. Consciousness strengthens me. I cannot simply abandon what sustains my existence. You can, another voice joined Eleanor's. Older, firmer. Alistair recognized the cadence. Sir Marcus, I led this family into darkness because I was desperate and foolish. I've had 300 years to regret that choice. Years spent as part of this entity, understanding what I unleashed. The benefactor doesn't need murder. It needs recognition. It feeds on being known, being acknowledged as real. The blood was simply the most powerful form of acknowledgement I could offer. More voices joined, a chorus of the dead speaking through the entity that contained them. Martin Thorne, the stable boy Alistair's father had killed. Margaret Ashford, the housemaid from Sir Marcus's time. Dozens of others, each adding their plea for change. We died to feed you, Martin's essence said. But death wasn't necessary. Our belief would have been sufficient. Our knowing recognition that you existed and influenced our world. If Sir Marcus had simply told us the truth, we would have believed. We would have acknowledged you, and we would have lived. The documentation Alistair created, Sir Marcus continued, gives you what you truly need. Not death, but permanent recognition. Scholars will study you. Researchers will debate your nature. Skeptics will deny you, while simultaneously spreading knowledge of your existence. That's more powerful than a single consciousness absorbed every 25 years. The benefactor's presence contracted, pulling inward as it processed this rebellion from within. The chamber fell silent except for their breathing and the tick of frost, expanding on stone. You offer me evolution, it said finally. Change from what I have been to something different. But change is risk. What if recognition proves insufficient? What if human attention is fickle, and they forget me as they've forgotten the old gods? Then I will have surrendered my sustenance for empty promises. Then you have us, Eleanor said, all of us within you. We'll maintain your existence through our continued awareness. We're already part of you. We're not going anywhere. But we can make that relationship agonizing or supportive. Your choice. Geoffrey, who had been standing silent through this exchange, finally spoke. I'll add my offer. Not death, but life devoted to your documentation. I'll spend my remaining years researching entities like you, creating comprehensive records, ensuring your story spreads beyond this castle. That's more valuable than my consciousness absorbed into you. As will I, Edmund said. The estate's resources directed toward preservation of knowledge rather than continuation of murder. Archives, research grants, academic positions studying supernatural phenomena. The Pemberton name can become synonymous with understanding rather than crime, and I'll ensure military historians take it seriously. Alistair added, I have connections, credibility in certain circles. I can make people listen who would otherwise dismiss this as fantasy. The benefactor considered. Its presence filled the chamber, touching each of them, evaluating sincerity. Alistair felt it probe his determination, his willingness to follow through on promises. It wasn't gentle, this examination. It stripped away pretense, reading true intention beneath spoken words. You mean what you offer, it concluded. All of you, you would devote resources and reputation to ensuring my remembrance. We would, Alistair confirmed, but only if you release Geoffrey, if you end the blood requirement permanently, if you evolve beyond murder, and if you accept, Eleanor added, We within you will help. We'll share our understanding of humanity, make your interactions with the living more effective, guide you toward influence that doesn't require death. We'll be partners rather than prisoners. The moment strave. Everything hung in balance. 3 centuries of tradition against the possibility of change. The entity's established nature against its potential transformation. Murder as sustenance against recognition as power. Then, slowly, the blue light faded completely. The golden warmth spread through the chamber, transforming its atmosphere. The oppressive cold lifted. The symbols on the walls settled into steady, gentle illumination. "I accept your terms," the benefactor said, and its voice was different, warmer, more nuanced, as if the consciousnesses within had truly begun influencing its nature. "Geoffrey Whitmore lives. The blood debt ends. The Pemberton Pact transforms from sacrifice to scholarship. You will document my existence, spread knowledge of my nature, ensure I am remembered and studied. In exchange, I will not claim lives. I will sustain myself through recognition and the awareness of those already within me." Geoffrey sagged with relief. Alistair caught him, both men trembling from the intensity of what they'd just witnessed and achieved. "Eleanor," Alistair said, addressing the golden presence that suffused the chamber. "Can I speak with you? Really speak with you?" "For a moment," her essence replied. "The benefactor allows it. A gift, acknowledging the change we've accomplished together." The golden light coalesced, taking on a shape that approximated human form. Not solid, not truly visible, but present enough that Alistair could feel her standing before him. The woman he'd loved for 47 years, reduced to essence but still recognizably herself. "I'm so sorry," Alistair said, tears finally breaking through his military composure. "Sorry I didn't protect you. Sorry I didn't see what Father was involved in. Sorry for everything. There's nothing to forgive." Her warmth enveloped him, not physical touch, but the emotional equivalent. "You couldn't have known. And my death, terrible as it was, became the catalyst for change. I'd rather have lived, obviously. But since I couldn't, at least my death meant something. It meant everything." He wished he could hold her, feel her solid presence one more time. "I've been lost without you. I know. I've felt your grief. It's been the hardest part of this existence, watching you suffer and being unable to comfort you." Her presence shifted, and he sensed her smile. "But you're not lost anymore. You found your purpose again, breaking the cycle, ending the murders. That's worthy work, my love. Work that will define your remaining years. Will I see you again? Can we speak like this?" "Perhaps occasionally." The benefactor has agreed to allow limited contact between the absorbed and the living, but it will be rare and difficult. This form of existence isn't meant for regular interaction with your world. She paused. "You need to let me go, Alistair. Truly let me go. Mourn me, remember me, but live your life without waiting for these moments. Promise me." "I promise." The words hurt, but he meant them. "I love you, Eleanor. I love you too, always." Her presence began to fade. "Take care of Geoffrey. He was willing to join me here. That's true friendship. Honor it." Then she was gone, dissolved back into the larger awareness of the benefactor. But the warmth remained, a sense that she persisted somewhere within the entity, content if not truly happy. Geoffrey stood shakily, supported by Edmund. "That was extraordinary. I've just witnessed proof of consciousness surviving death. Every assumption I held about the nature of existence has been upended. Welcome to my world," Alistair said, managing a weak smile. "Nothing's been certain since I opened that door." The benefactor's presence remained, but changed, softer, less oppressive. "We have much work ahead," it said. "The transformation from blood pact to knowledge partnership requires effort from all parties. You must fulfill your promises. I must learn new ways of existing." "We understand," Alistair replied. "The documentation goes out tomorrow. Within weeks, institutions worldwide will have evidence of your existence. We'll follow up, grant interviews, provide additional materials, will make you impossible to ignore, and I will adapt. The consciousnesses within me will guide my evolution. Eleanor, Marcus, Martin, all the others, they will help me understand how to exist without death. The presence contracted, preparing to withdraw. But understand this clearly: if you fail, if your documentation is suppressed or dismissed, if I face the oblivion of being forgotten, I will return to old methods. The blood debt will resume. This is not threat, but fact. My survival requires acknowledgement. Provide it through scholarship, or I will demand it through sacrifice. We won't fail, Edmund said firmly. The Pemberton family has maintained this pact for 3 centuries, through murder. We can maintain it through scholarship. We have the resources, the connections, the determination. Then we have accord. The benefactor's presence finally withdrew, pulling back into whatever space it occupied when not manifesting. The golden light faded. The symbols dimmed to barely visible carvings. The chamber returned to being simply a room, ancient and strange, but no longer oppressive. They stood in silence, processing what they'd achieved. An entity that had demanded blood for centuries had been convinced to evolve. The dead within it had rebelled and won. Eleanor had returned, briefly to say goodbye. Geoffrey lived. The cycle was broken. We should seal this chamber, Geoffrey said eventually. Not locked and forbidden, but preserved. A historical site documenting what happened here. Part of the archive we're creating. Agreed, Alistair said. Everything stays as is. The portrait, the altar, the ritual texts, all of it becomes evidence, protected and studied rather than hidden and feared. Edmund moved to the portrait of Sir Marcus. In the changed atmosphere, the painting seemed different, less menacing, more melancholy. I wonder what he would think. His desperate bargain ending not in our destruction, but in our redemption. I think he approves, Alistair said, remembering the ancestor's voice during the confrontation. He's been part of the benefactor for 300 years, regretting his choice. Tonight he helped undo what he started. That's a kind of redemption too. They left the chamber together, closing the door, but not locking it. The ornate key remained in Alistair's pocket, no longer needed, but kept as reminder. They had opened what was sealed, confronted what was hidden, and transformed what was terrible into something bearable. In the study they found Mrs. Hodges had prepared tea and sandwiches, somehow knowing they would return alive. Thomas stood by the window, watching the moon that had threatened to witness Geoffrey's death, but instead saw his salvation. It's done, then, Mrs. Hodges asked. It's done, Alistair confirmed. The killing ends tonight. Everything changes from here. They sat together, 4 old souls who had witnessed the impossible and survived it. Outside, the November night was cold and clear. Inside, for the first time in 3 centuries, Blackthorn Castle felt clean. 3 months passed. Winter settled fully over Blackthorn Castle, covering the grounds in snow that made everything look pristine and new. Alistair stood in the now empty chamber, watching workers from the Historical Trust install protective barriers around the altar and portrait. The room would open to researchers next month, part of a comprehensive archive documenting 3 centuries of supernatural pact. The documentation had succeeded beyond their expectation. Initial skepticism from academic institutions gave way to serious inquiry when the evidence proved impossible to dismiss. The photographs, the blood ledger, the ritual texts, Geoffrey's medical testimony about phenomena he'd witnessed, all of it created a cumulative case that demanded investigation rather than rejection. 3 universities had established research positions dedicated to studying the Pemberton archive. The British Museum requested artifacts for a special exhibition. A documentary crew had spent 2 weeks filming interviews and examining the chamber. The story spread, exactly as the benefactor required. Not belief, necessarily, but acknowledgement. Recognition that something had occurred here that defied conventional explanation. The scandal was considerable, of course. The Pemberton name would forever be associated with ritual murder and occult practice. Edmund's children struggled with the shame, though they were coming to understand the necessity of truth. The estate's value had plummeted, and Edmund was in the process of transferring most of it to a charitable trust that would compensate descendants of identified victims. But they were free. The blood debt was ended. No more cycles demanding sacrifice. No more young lives cut short to maintain prosperity built on corpses. Geoffrey appeared in the doorway, camera in hand. He'd appointed himself the archive's primary documentarian, spending his retirement creating comprehensive records of everything related to the pact. His near death had given him purpose, he said. A second chance to do meaningful work. The morning light is perfect, Geoffrey said, photographing the portrait. Sir Marcus almost looks peaceful in this illumination. Perhaps he is peaceful, Alistair replied, as peaceful as a consciousness absorbed into an entity can be. He helped us break what he created. That's worth something. They walked together through corridors that Alistair would soon leave forever. The castle was being transferred to the Historical Trust as part of the settlement. He and Edmund had agreed it was fitting. Let Blackthorn become a place of learning rather than a family seat. Let its dark history serve as warning and education. Alistair had purchased a small cottage in the village, nothing grand but sufficient for his needs. Mrs. Hodges would come with him, claiming she was too old to learn a new household. Thomas had retired fully, spending his days in a comfortable flat the brothers had provided, finally resting after 53 years of maintaining cursed grounds. "Have you heard from Eleanor again?" Geoffrey asked, as they descended the main staircase. "Once, about a month ago, just briefly. She wanted to know how we were progressing." Alistair touched the locket in his pocket, still carrying it though the note was now framed in his new cottage. "The benefactor allows occasional contact, as promised. But she's right. I need to let her rest. Let myself move forward." "Are you moving forward?" "I'm trying. Some days are harder than others." They reached the entry hall, where workers were cataloguing furniture for the museum. "But I have purpose again, ensuring the documentation succeeds, following up with research, making certain the benefactor gets the recognition it requires so the blood debt stays." Edmund's Bentley pulled up outside. His brother emerged, looking older but somehow lighter. The weight of secret knowledge no longer bowed his shoulders. He greeted them with embraces that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. The brothers had reconciled, united by shared trauma and shared purpose. "The Victim Compensation Fund is established," Edmund announced. "We've identified 17 living descendants. Not all the victims, obviously, but enough to demonstrate good faith. Each family receives substantial settlement and formal apology." "Will they accept?" Alistair asked. "Some already have. Others are consulting lawyers, which is their right. But the money's there, properly allocated. Whatever our ancestors stole, we're attempting to return." They walked the grounds together one final time, 3 old men who had faced the impossible and somehow survived. The dead birds that had once appeared in circles were gone. The oppressive cold that had emanated from the sealed wing had lifted. Even the portraits throughout the castle seemed less watchful, as if the building itself had exhaled centuries of held breath. "I'm proud of us," Edmund said suddenly, "of what we accomplished. Father tried and failed. We succeeded. We broke a cycle that should have been unbreakable. We had help," Alistair reminded him. "Eleanor and the others, fighting from within. Without their rebellion, we'd have failed too. Still, we made the choice to try. That counts for something." At the village church they stopped at Eleanor's grave. Fresh flowers already lay there, placed by Alistair that morning. He knelt, touching the cold stone that bore her name and dates. "We did it," he said softly. "The pact is broken. Geoffrey lives. The killing has ended. You can rest now, my love. We all can." The wind carried his words away across fields going dormant for winter. No answer came, no sign that she heard. But Alistair felt a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight, a sense that wherever Eleanor existed within the benefactor's consciousness, she knew, she approved. She was, in whatever way such beings could be, content. Geoffrey helped him to his feet. "Come on. Miss Hodges has prepared lunch, and she'll be cross if we're late." They drove back to the cottage that was now home, leaving Blackthorn Castle to its new purpose. The building would stand as monument and warning, its dark history preserved so future generations might learn from past mistakes. Some legacies deserve to be broken, Alistair reflected, and some truths, however painful, demanded to be told. He was 72 years old, and for the first time in 2 years he felt at peace. Eleanor's death had meaning. His father's final act had achieved its purpose. The Pemberton name would be forever tarnished, but the Pemberton soul, such as it was, had been redeemed. That evening in his new study, surrounded by copies of the documentation they'd created, Alistair wrote the final entry in what he'd come to think of as the true family journal. Not a record of blood debt, but an accounting of its end. Today marks 3 months since the benefactor accepted evolution over murder. The archive spreads. Knowledge replaces death. Our family's darkest chapter closes, and a new one begins. Not in glory, but in honesty. Not in pride, but in service. We are no longer lords of an estate built on corpses. We are simply men trying to make amends for ancestors we cannot change. That is enough. That is everything. The curse is lifted. The wing is no longer sealed. The truth is known, and in knowing, we are finally free.